glad to be here this morning. My hope was when I came here, there would be lots of people that I did not know, because that would mean we're attracting new participants in the Gateway Medical Society. So when I sat down and walked around and introduced myself to so many new people today, new to me, probably familiar to others, but I'm so happy to be here and to see the turnout. I went through fog to get here, and I hope your travel was easier than mine. But we're going to get started with this morning's important symposium, Equity Matters in the Healthcare Workforce, Provider Healthcare Symposium. And to all the folks that are watching us on either Facebook or other live stream, welcome. We're glad that you're with us. And I want to say that this program was really the brainchild of our president, Dr. Chris Conte. And we're responding to a need. I'm of this generation where I've been in Pittsburgh. This is my home city, but I was away, came back to be here. And it was the Gateway Medical Society that made me feel welcome in this town, my own hometown. But because I had lived most of my adult life away, it was the Gateway Medical Society that gave me roots in Pittsburgh again. So I'm hoping that one thing will happen as a result of the symposium. If you're not a member of the Gateway Medical Society, you will become one today. This can be your home away from home. This can be your connection with your peers. This can be a place where you can go to share concerns that you might not be able to share outside of this community. So our objectives today are outlined in the program. I hope you got a program. Our objectives are to discuss the history of the medical school pipeline programs in the United States, where we are today, what are the deficits, where do we need to go, and to equip providers at various stages of training with the skills to navigate. I call it the isms, the things that we never really can talk about, or we didn't talk about, that impede our day-to-day well-being as healthcare providers. We're going to talk about ways to optimize financial wellness, and we're going to create a forum for meeting the challenges of healthcare equity within the physician workforce and the healthcare workforce here in Pittsburgh. So that's our program overview. I hope you feel welcome. We're going to make this interactive. We're going to make this informal. We're going to make this what you want it to be. So I encourage you, as you sit at this table, to write down one thing you want to get out of this session today. Take a minute. Think about it. What is one thing that you want to get out of this session today? And make sure, before you leave, that you get that one thing accomplished today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Conte, President of the Gateway Medical Society.
Good morning, everybody. Just a few housekeeping matters. If you haven't already signed in, if you are a physician or a nurse in particular, and you are hoping to get CME or CNE credit, please make sure at some point today you fill out the sign-in sheet so that your name and credentials and information can be submitted so you can get your CME certificate. I know that this program's been approved for both 4.5 hours of CME and CNE credit. So if you are in need of CME or CNE credits, you can get 4.5 hours of those here today, but make sure you sign in so that we can submit your information. Also, again, we are excited that we have this opportunity. I've been a member of Gateway now since, the early 2000s. I've been here in Pittsburgh since 2001, but as a member of the executive committee for the last now 2 going on 3 years. And the EC members will tell you that wellness is a big thing to me. My thought process is that well physicians, whether healthy, well, and balanced, who are intentional and consistent with self-care practices are healthier and in turn able to provide better care for their patients. And so that's really where this is coming from. This is not intended to be kind of the standard DEI kind of conversation. It's really kind of a play on words. Equity matters. Yes, we know it's important, but these are equity matters that impact us day to day, which ultimately, you know, if we're carrying some of those burdens day after day into our practice spaces, it does bleed into our practices and how we care for our patients. So our hope today is that you'll get something from this that you did not know, give you a different perspective on how you may be navigating some part of your journey, wherever that journey may be right now, whether you're a medical student, a resident or fellow, just out of residency practicing or have been practicing for years or even decades. We hope that you will find and extract something of value from today's session. Just as Dr. Johnson said, I've seen some new faces, so it's wonderful to see new people. One of the things that we are really trying to promote over this calendar year is the concept of your gateway. This is your organization, your society, and our desire is to not just come to members with asks. We need you to, we want you to, but our objective is to first meet your needs, whether it be professional, developmental, emotional support, cultural support, whatever it is, and then it will become a very intuitive and logical next step for you to want to be more engaged in some of the great work that this society has been involved in the greater Pittsburgh area for the last 6 decades. So we're going to start off this morning. You know, I remember I can't say that I was a product of the Project 3000 by 2000 initiative that began in 1991, but I remember going through residency and through medical school and some of my residency with that really just being an overarching movement across medical schools all over the country. And so we're going to be talking about the health professions pipeline, and we're specifically talking today, at least in this conversation, from the perspective of medical school. But the diversity pipeline issues that we're talking about are not unique to medical schools only, but that's the perspective that I'm coming from. And so we're going to talk about this professions pipeline and how it sprung some leaks. And as a result of those leaks, we're not seeing the movement of the needle the way many had envisioned. We're still woefully underrepresented, regardless of the underrepresented group that you may associate yourself with. We need to, as a health professions culture, as a country, do a better job, because as we all now consistently know, that a more diversified health professions workforce not just improves the workforce, but it improves outcomes. And we are in an evidence-driven, outcome-based, profession. And so to be able to improve outcomes is our ultimate objective, and a diversified workforce helps us do that. So if at any point you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. And so I see a number of younger physicians, because now I've transitioned from younger physician to old head, so now I'm an old head. And so some of the things I'm going to be talking about will perhaps be new to you, but I think it helps give you perspective. And for those who are in my generation of physician who kind of transitioned from medical school to resident and practicing physician right around the Y2K period, these are some familiar terms and some conversations. So we're going to talk about really briefly today where we came from. And when I say we, I'm talking about physicians of color. Again, as I started in medical school, I became really enamored by the history that extends far beyond the intercontinental slave trade, but it extends further back to ancient Africa, ancient Kemet. And so we're going to talk about that legacy and how it needs to be used as fuel in order to help us do what we need to do to diversify our health professions workforce. And we're going to talk a little bit about where we are and what we need to do to get to where I think we all agree we need to be, which is an ultimately optimally diversified workforce. So from the perspective of Africans and their contribution to medicine, it goes back thousands of years. While others in Europe were still figuring out basic concepts, living in caves, hunter-gatherers moving from place to place, those along the Nile Delta were studying the stars, building enormous structures, creating libraries, and studying medicine. Imhotep, arguably the first multi-genius in the world. He was an architect, he was an engineer. Many of us know him as a physician, and his works are well documented. And I often talk with students and residents about these kind of historical perspectives because for me, it was important to understand that this is a legacy birthright, not something that I've been made to feel, I should just be happy and blessed to be in the number, when in reality, I'm a benefactor of this rich history. So really, I'm entitled to be where I am, not because someone validated it by admitting me into a medical school, but because this is my history. And if it weren't for my ancestors, there would be no medical schools at all. And for me, that was a transformational thought process to come at it from the perspective of this is a birthright and not something that I should just feel blessed to have been given the opportunity to participate in. So Imhotep is kind of an anchor for this whole diversity discussion, because whether we talk about African contributions or South American, Central American, or indigenous people and their contributions to what is now medicine, those are all part of the stories of many people who right now are being systematically excluded from the opportunity to become health professionals. I like this picture because, people speculate a lot, but this is from ancient Egypt, and people have said, oh, well, they were brain surgeons. Well, this was not a brain surgery. This was a skull surgery. But it's clear that it was an intentional attempt to remove a portion of the skull for some purpose, which speaks to the level of innovative thought. It takes an innovator to be in a place where there's no CT, no MRI, no X-ray, no complicated fancy equipment to say, I think I'm going to put a burr hole in a skull and see what happens. But there are countless skulls throughout all of these cultures that I just mentioned where these cranial procedures were done, which speaks on a lot of levels about the level of sophistication of scientific thought that was going on long before Europe attributes as the beginning and the birthplace of medicine. I don't know if you can see that, but this gentleman, Onesimus, his slave-given name, he was named after his master, Cotton Mather, but he was not a physician, but he was clearly a scientist, perhaps one of the world's first public health workers. But what he was able to do was he was able to demonstrate in 1721 that you could inoculate individuals with smallpox and prevent the epidemic spread of that scourge. And so again, this is part of our history. And I don't know to what extent it impacts people. I know it impacts me knowing where I came from and knowing what contributions people who look like me may have made to the advancement of science. And so Onesimus is a story that needs to be told because someone may say, hey, that looks like my uncle, that looks like my grandfather. And for them to now see that person and associate them with scientific discovery can be a transformational moment in the mind of a young person. So James Durham was arguably the first identified physician, though he did not formally go to medical school, but he taught himself to read at a young age. He bought his own freedom at age 21, which was very, very difficult to do during the time of the intercontinental slave trade. He had established himself because of this prowess he had with being able to be a diagnostician He caught the attention of multiple slave masters, but one of whom hired him specifically, bought him as a slave, not to work in the field, not to work in the house as a servant, but to work on providing medical services for both slaves and his own family. If you Google some pictures, some drawings of Dr. Durham, you'll find that there's a picture of him providing care to what is assumed to be his master's daughter, with the mother overlooking. So we all know as health providers that there's an implicit level of trust that goes with someone allowing you to have you in that vulnerable place where you're providing health care. And during the midst of the intercontinental slave trade, this man believed that the best chance of receiving quality care for his white daughter was to allow his black slave to provide medical services. I mean, for me, that's a transformational thought process, to think that in the midst of all that was going on, when he found himself in a situation of need, he went to a slave to get health care. I mean, think about that. That's a deep, deep thought, but that's part of the story, and I believe the story that it tells really can be used as fuel. He also, again, similar to Onesimus, as you can see, infectious disease was a huge thing in early U.S. history. During the yellow fever epidemic of 1789, he also was an instrumental public health worker in that regard. And again, this is without any formal medical training. Then we have David Jones Peck, who is identified as the first African American to graduate from a United States medical school, from Rush Medical College in 1847. And the list goes on and on and on. James McCune Smith, he was the first identified African American medical student, though he went to school in Scotland. But again, I like some of the words that some of these early providers and pioneers used to describe what it was they were doing within the context. And you'll notice that a lot of what they were saying, even in the 1800s, is so relevant today. So James McCune Smith said, "The great hindrance to the advancement of colored people is the want of unity, but we are not united because we are not equally oppressed." Doesn't that sound familiar? And he was observing this and its impact even during the early 1800s. If we were to unite in pursuit of any one object, I can imagine no possibility beyond our power to compass. In other words, if we work together, there's nothing that we can't do. And that we is anyone who is like-minded and singularly focused on creating a space where everyone has the opportunity to make those contributions. He was also arguably one of the first evidence-based physicians. And in fact, as an African American in the 1850s in New York, he was a founding member of the New York Statistics Society. So he was an epidemiologically oriented provider in the early 1800s. And then Rebecca Lee Crumpler was an incredible woman. Went to nursing school first before becoming a physician. But if you look at the quotes that she uses in her own autobiography to describe what her driving forces were, many of us would argue that those are some of those same things that resonate in our own experience, as well as in the experiences of those young students out there in elementary school or middle school who are aspiring to become health providers. She said, very early on, I conceived a liking for and sought every opportunity to relieve the suffering of other people. That's an amazing thought. To be, on the heels, in the midst of slavery, and be concerned about the healing needs of others. I entered into my work with vigor, seeing women and their children for treatment regardless of their ability to pay. Wow. That's an amazing comment from someone. And she, again, was as observant as Dr. McCune Smith's. Selfish prudence is often allowed to come between duty and human life. In other words, people's pride and their own motivated self-interest prevent us from doing the right thing by each other. And that's an incredibly powerful statement. So she went to the New England Female Medical College, and it's interesting because at the time when a female physician graduated, they were called a doctress, not a doctor. So if you look at her credentials in her own writing, she said, I obtained my degree and became a doctress in 1864. But she's also one of the world's first African-American, or if not the first African-American female author, or African-American author of a medical text, and in fact wrote 2 books on women's and children's health in the late 1800s. And those are available. You can get copies of those books and those writings, which I thought were really quite remarkable. So as we moved through the 1800s, we began to develop ways of formally training people of color because there were very few opportunities for people of color who had interest to get formal training. It wasn't that they were less qualified necessarily, but it was very interesting that some of the things that were set up to, say, prevent people from voting were the same things that were used to try to prevent people from going to medical school. They would ask you to be able to read a sentence on a page. If you couldn't read the sentence, then you were not eligible. The criteria, there was no MCAT, there was just, could you read a sentence? And if you couldn't read the sentence to their satisfaction, then you weren't accepted in the medical school. So suffice it to say that the number of medical students of color at that time were very, very small. And so we started seeing the development of medical schools that were created, some with federal funding, post-Civil War, to train physicians of color. And the very first hospital was the Freedmen's Hospital, which was actually training both physicians and nurses in the 1860s. It was one of those places where after you received your 40 acres and your mule, if you needed health care, you could come to DC and come to the Freedmen's Hospital and receive health care. And from that, some 4 or 5 years later, Howard University College of Medicine was opened, and then Meharry in Tennessee, Charles Drew. There, you see that huge gap of almost 100 years between the opening of Meharry and the opening of Charles Drew on the West Coast. So again, there was this 100-year gap where there was no movement in creating spaces for physicians of color to be trained, and no movement within majority institutions of recruiting or retaining students of color. So there was this, there was this glut of physicians of color, though the number of people of color in the country was beginning to grow. And then Morehouse opened in 1975, and then we have 2 proposed medical schools that are linked to historically black colleges and universities that are scheduled to open in the next couple of years. Maryland College of Osteopathic Medicine at Morgan State University in Baltimore, and Xavier University in New Orleans in 2027, both of which will be osteopathic medical schools. But they are well in the process. They are really well funded, and the goal is to help fortify the pipeline by producing more physicians of color. So by the mid-1980s, it became really clear, particularly, and historians will say that with the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, Secretary, what was his title? His brother, Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General, and Dr. Martin Luther King, with this groundswell of increased attention to disparity and racism and injustice, medical schools began to recognize that there was this disparity in the number of medical students of color and the importance. They began to at least acknowledge internally that there was an important gap that needed to be filled. But nonetheless, there was no infrastructure to do that. And prior to 1970, only about 5% of medical school applicants were African American. And of those, 9 out of every 10 went to one of those medical schools. So there were very few. If you were, if you were a student of color, or a woman for that matter, and you were going to one of these large majority medical schools, it was not uncommon for you to be not just the only one in your class, but perhaps the only one on campus. So imagine how that must have felt when you overlay that with all of the stuff that you go through emotionally, physically, intellectually, just to navigate medical training. And now you're doing it in a vacuum where you're 1 out of 300 or 400. And then also trying to navigate just life in general in that same space. And so, there became this awareness, but, there still really wasn't an infrastructure. And so we didn't see a whole lot of movement of the needle. In the 70s, there was some increase in the number of underrepresented students of color. But then in the late 80s, early 90s, with the advent of the Association of American Medical Colleges, the AAMC, there was this more intentional effort to try to understand and then develop strategies to fix the disparity. And in 1991, the AAMC, their president at the time, Dr. Petersdorf, hired Dr. Herbert Nickens, an African-American physician, I guess the first DEI hire of the AAMC, and from that hire and that work, they developed this project called Project 3000 by 2000. At the time, there were about 1,200 African-American medical students who had matriculated in the then 126 U.S. allopathic medical schools, and they wanted to increase that number by close to 40% in a decade. And the first thing they had to do was try to convince the medical school deans that this was relevant. And so when you read the story of how this all unfolded, you find that when they began to approach the deans, they asked, they said, hey, we want to meet and we want to discuss diversity. And they said, lo and behold, 124 of the 124 medical school deans showed up. So they were really excited about the fact that everybody came to the room to have the conversation. But then they had to operationalize these concepts. And so Project 3000 by 2000 represented a 10-year attempt to exponentially almost increase the amount of diversity in medical schools, specifically looking at the African-American medical school matriculants. And by mid-1990s, they had increased the number to almost 2,000. So they had significantly moved the needle, but then by the end of that decade, they had fallen short. And as they began to kind of do their hot wash and try to figure out why they started to see the needle move in one direction and then move backwards, they began to realize that some things were happening behind the scenes. And in the 1990s, what started to happen is all of these initiatives that had been signed off on and bought in by medical schools all around the country, you began to start to see the first reverse discrimination law suits enacted not just against medical schools, but law schools, graduate schools, undergraduate campuses. And it struck fear in the minds of the medical schools. And so that, again, began to drive decision-making, not necessarily because they didn't agree that the diversity need was important, but because of the highly cumbersome task of litigating reverse discrimination lawsuits. And so you started to see this plateau in the late 90s. And that plateau lasted for 30 years. 30 years. Moving the needle in less than a decade. Moving the needle in 5 years by bringing deans of every medical school together to say, we understand that and this was without all the population health data we now have, which clearly demonstrates that a diverse health professions workforce improves outcomes. This was just an acknowledgement that our school is filled with white men who are training to be doctors in a community that is very diverse and growing in diversity, and we need to fix it. So in 5 years' time, you started to see the needle move, but then one several year period of time of litigation, and it created stagnation that lasted for 30 years. And then we started to see some movement again, of the needle in a positive direction. And by this time, the number of African Americans in the US population had grown from about 9.8% to now about 13, almost 14%. Yet the number of physicians had stagnated. So the gap actually got bigger. So in the 21st century, now we find that these are data now from the AAMC from 2023, which reflects data collected in 21 and 22. 14.7% rise in self-identified indigenous individuals. They're still classified in the AAMC literature as you see it on the screen, American Indian or Alaska Native. But in general, it represents the indigenous people. 4.5% rise in self-identified Hispanic and Latino, which we now know as Latinx. But again, from the literature purpose, that's how it's in the publication. But notice at the bottom that there's been a 0.1% drop in the number of individuals matriculating to medical school who are identified as African American. So we peaked at about 10.2%, and now we're at about 10%. But we've never quite gotten to parity. And so this is the 21st century landscape. So when we look at what's happened recently, we see the same thing that happened in the 1990s. At the end of the 1990s, we start to see it happening again. And so now the Supreme Court has recently ruled, last summer in fact, that have ruled that using race as an identifier and a distinguisher and a determinant in decision-making is a violation of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. And although the cases that were before the Supreme Court did not specifically speak to medical schools, what the court cases did do is allow schools and graduate schools to begin to understand that they are held to the same standards that were discussed in the majority opinion. It says university programs must comply with strict scrutiny. They may never use race as a stereotype or negative. At some point, they must end. Admission systems, however well-intentioned and implemented in good faith, fail each of these criteria. They must therefore be invalidated under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. In other words, you can't use race to make decisions in order to try to create a level playing field, in order to create parity and equity. But there are some caveats to that. The U.S. Department of Education, who now has to oversee the implementation of the U.S. Supreme Court, has also chimed in, and they interpret this majority opinion and legal standard of what the majority opinion calls this strict scrutiny, and they say that these issues also apply to scholarships and financial aid. So now you've got a group of disenfranchised individuals from underrepresented groups, many of whom clearly and consistently state that the lack of scholarship and financial subsidy are barriers. And now the U.S. Department of Education is also saying that if we apply the rule as stated in the U.S. Supreme Court's majority opinion, that you cannot use race as a determinant for scholarships. So not only are we impacting the influx of talent, but we're now impacting the talent that's been identified, many of whom may not go to medical school because they can't afford it. This ripple effect, as we know, it's impacting not just the front side of this pipeline. What is happening is now that the thought is that as we lose this opportunity to continue to diversify the health professions workforce, now we also will see that down the road. So fewer medical students of color, fewer residents and fellows of color, fewer physicians and faculty of color, and as we again know, this impacts outcomes. So at the end of all of this, from a population health standpoint, it is safe to assume that with the loss of diversity, we will start to see worsening of health outcomes, which as a health profession, we have to then step up and stand up and speak to that. And so we have to understand that ripple effect. David Henderson from the AMA last summer, when asked to comment on the Supreme Court ruling, he said, when it comes to medical school enrollment, there's an upward trajectory. However, even that's not as steep as it needs to be. So in certain groups, there is some upward trend. Among African Americans, we see this plateau, and now we're starting to see this tailing off. And he says that it's not as steep as it needs to be. We are now faced with the probability, just based on the data, that this trajectory is going to change, and we may well see some significant decreases unless we figure out how to pivot. Isn't that what medicine's all about? Trying to figure out how to pivot. You know, you come in with a plan for your patient, and then something happens and you have to pivot. And so the argument from the AMA, for example, is that we have to begin to pivot. So how do medical schools pivot? It says we are in and have been in a fairly poor situation for some time, and the loss of affirmative action is only going to make things more difficult. Schools are in largely uncharted territory. They recognize the need for change, but now they're handcuffed. So even those schools that want to implement ways to diversify now find themselves restricted because they don't want to be labeled as being in violation of Supreme Court rulings. So schools are in these uncharted places, medical schools collectively, to determine what is the most productive way to move forward. How can we come up with creative ways to continue to aspire to have a diversified medical student population within the restrictive environment that the Supreme Court has created? There is broad consensus that we do need to move forward, but no one knows how. So there are people in medical schools that do want to see change. So where do we go? What do we need to do to make this happen? Within the framework of what the Supreme Court says, what the Department of Education, U.S. Department of Education say, can we find a sweet spot somewhere in the middle where we can continue to move the needle without violating the constitutional rights of others? So how do we equip candidates and prepare them? We've got to come up with medical school specific skills development. I've said this in many forms in the past. I am not anti-STEAM, anti-STEM, but our lane is preparing young minds to become physicians. So we need to stay in our lane. Let STEM be STEM, let STEAM be STEAM. We all have time and talent, but we also have our lives and our careers. So it's much easier for all of us if we stay in our lane. And our lane is trying to create medical school specific opportunities to engage students during their journey, right? That STEAM can do the STEAM stuff, but when you come and engage, say, Gateway Medical Society or some other medical society, what are we going to be using that time for? We're going to be using that time specifically to say, okay, you have said you want to be a doctor, or you're not sure, but you're here today amongst doctors wanting to learn more about what it is to be a doctor. So we're going to use our time to talk about that. We're not going to take you to the Connect Lab, and we're not going to teach you all these fancy STEM things. We're going to talk about medicine, right? So that's one way we can help with equipping the pipeline. We need to teach critical thinking and problem solving. Many of our young people are deficient in those areas. We need to begin to incorporate trauma-informed engagement and mentorship. Some of our students, and we have Dr. Salahuddin here who's going to talk to us all about our self-care toolkit, but some of these children can't learn because they're coming to the learning space with a bunch of stuff. And so even with our best of intentions, if we don't begin to incorporate some understanding of trauma-informed engagement and mentorship, then it's a missed opportunity. It's great that they can come to your office and see you see patients, but if we can equip you with the skills you need to be able to engage those students during the time that you spend with them from a trauma-informed perspective, then that is a much more valuable use of time that goes beyond just them seeing you do what you do in the office. Longitudinal, age-appropriate programming, right? The pipeline doesn't start at any one particular place, but if we start early, introducing people in an age-appropriate way to science and medicine, and we follow them through this longitudinal place, then we may have someone just like our ancestors who early on said they knew they had this propensity to want to help people. We can begin to identify that desire and grow it at an early age. We need to have multiple pathway on-ramps, meaning that pathway programs need to have different places where people can enter and feel that they can safely exit the pathway. It's okay to take the off-ramp if after being in a pathway program for, say, 2 years, you now know, you know what, medicine's not for me. That's okay. But we also don't want to lock people out by saying that the only way in is at just this one on-ramp. So we have to create these collaborative and collective ways to allow students to enter the pipeline, enter the pathway at multiple stages. I mean, to be honest, if I didn't decide I wanted to be a physician until my senior year of college. Now, I don't know that there's a pathway program that could have helped me that late in the game, but suffice it to say that if, say, you're in middle school, you may not know what you want to do, but it'd be nice that if by the time you transition, say, from 7th and 8th grade to high school, if now you found a passion, that there's an on-ramp for you and a program that can help you navigate the next steps. We need to have these, what I call linked endowed matriculation guarantees, meaning these pipeline programs need to be attached to an endpoint. If you successfully navigate, you get into my medical school. That is not a violation of the Constitution. It's not a violation of the 14th Amendment. You are now given preferential opportunity to matriculate because you were part of a longitudinal pipeline program and successfully completed it. What better carrot to dangle in front of a student than to say, and programs all over the city, CCAC, for example, does it, where they can help guarantee employment if you finish the curriculum. That's an incredible incentive, and it also allows us to create these longitudinal pathways. Social and health determinants of learning and academic success. These programs need to have people who understand that, yes, we have the social determinants of health, but there are also social and health determinants of learning. These kids are coming to school, haven't eaten, aren't sleeping, are homeless. And so unless we begin to look at the child and people in these pipeline programs below the surface, what we see on the surface is just that tip of that iceberg. But these programs need to be a little bit more comprehensive in their approach to how these young people learn. We all know that not every person's journey to become a health professional is linear. Many of these young people have these non-linear journeys, and the non-linear journey is where we need to be engaging them the most. And we need to have data-driven, outcome-driven programs. So it's not just something that's not a one and done, here's our program. We need to then critically evaluate the programs, make sure that in real time or in near real time, we're producing the results that we say we intend to produce. And then we make the modifications that are necessary based on the data. Right? So we have to be just as meticulous and evidence-driven in developing the programs as we are in managing our patients. How do we support the pipeline? Particularly as it relates to candidate selection. So if the Supreme Court says we can no longer, or medical schools can no longer use race as a determinant for matriculation, but they've left the door open for creativity. How do you do that? So you can establish what many medical schools are now calling the holistic interview practices and standards. Looking at the whole applicant, not just, so not factoring in race directly or gender directly, but looking at the whole applicant and developing an application process that allows a selection committee to dive into these elements which the medical school may philosophically believe are important. For example, considering whether an applicant was raised in a medically underserved community. You can ask that question. That's not a racist question. I mean, if we look numerically, there are more poor white people in America than there are poor black people. So looking at where someone grew up and using it at some level as a factor in evaluating their readiness for medical school is a valuable tool, especially if you're trying to create a diversified medical school community. Considering whether an applicant speaks more than one language. In a growingly diverse community, that's an important skill as well as an important way of trying to infuse the importance of diversity when you select your medical school community. Demonstrated commitment to work in underserved communities. So community service. What are you doing with your time? Where are you spending your time? Because those, as many who have participated in community service will tell you, that's transformational internally. To be able to draw on those experiences, whether it was somewhere internationally, locally, going back to your hometown, working at a soup kitchen, working in your church, all of those things shape your toolkit as a provider, but they shape who you become. And so why would a medical school not want to delve into that conversation if they're looking to create a diverse space for learning? Establishing relationships with undergraduate institutions with demonstrated diversity. That would make, I mean, that's logical. If you look at a particular school and 2% of the school is represented by underrepresented groups, then it's not likely that you're going to get a lot of medical school applicants that are diverse from an undergraduate school that's not diverse. So maybe we begin to look and use as a criterion for our admissions committees to say, hey, let's look at the schools who are doing well at diversifying their campuses, because that's where we're going to likely find the most diverse matriculants. And that would make sense. Maybe that's where you know, if you've got 1 or 2 people in your admissions office who are helping with your pipeline program, your pre-matriculation program, well, if you've only got a certain number of days and a certain amount of money to spend, then why would you want to spend that money going to school X when only 2% of school X's population is diverse versus going to school Y where 35% of their campus population is diverse? Demonstrated sustained interest. So are they participating in pipeline programs? Are they participating in summer programs? Those are important questions that should be asked if the goal is to try to create a diverse class for your medical school. And curricular tracks to meet certain diversity goals. I've done some work with the Warren Alpert School of Medicine at Brown University, and they have a number of tracks for their medical school. You can start the medical school in a population health track or a primary care track. And they understand that there's some movement, but their data suggests that there's not a lot of movement because when you know at that point. You know you want to be a primary care provider at that point. You know you're interested in serving in underserved communities at that point, and they want to help shape that experience around what it is you know you want to do. And that also helps them diversify their student body. Of the 60 new medical schools accredited since 2020, 55% of them have referenced diversity language in their mission statements. And that should say 2002, not 2020. Because 60 medical schools in 3 years? No, it's since 2002. Over half of them have specific language in their mission statement about diversity, but yet their diversity numbers look nothing like, or look just like those schools who don't have any language about diversity. So, as we would say, talk is cheap, right? Don't just talk the talk. You got to walk it out too. And so there's a disconnect. You know, it looks good to put it in your mission statement and put that mission statement on your website, but when you visit campus, it doesn't look like your mission statement. That's how I interpret that statement from that JAMA report. You know, I look at schools like Brown, and Brown, granted, is in a small state. You know, in Rhode Island, you're only 15 minutes away from anything. But in Rhode Island, they've done two things that help strengthen their pipeline. They put a nursing-only high school, and they're about to open Med Prep, which is a pre-medical only high school, and they put them in underserved communities. And in those underserved communities, grades 9 through 12, these are charter schools, so they are free to the applicant. And they are specifically trying to deal with the health profession shortage, the diversity problem in Rhode Island by creating these two institutions of learning. That's not saying that other schools aren't producing people who go to med school, but what they're saying is that they are creating these spaces of learning in communities of color and diversity, and they're not excluding people who come from, say, downtown Providence, but the schools in Central Falls, which is largely Hispanic, largely Portuguese, largely African American, and statistically has some of the worst health outcome numbers in the state. But they're going to put a school to train doctors in the poorest community because they understand that by creating a space for learning, they can move the needle. Right? So that's what's required. It's that kind of thought process and that kind of action at the state legislative level. You know, we now have 2 medical schools here. We have Pitt, and we have LECOM's Greensburg campus. We have Duquesne, that's going to open in August. And in 2 more or 3 more years, we're going to have IUP's College of Osteopathic Medicine in Indiana. We're going to have 4 medical schools in the next 5 years, which means we're going to get 400 to 500 to 600 new wannabe doctors coming into this community every single year, on top of the residents and fellows that are here and the practicing providers. We have an opportunity to do really amazing things in moving the needle here in Pittsburgh. So my hope is that as we try to think about for the rest of this day and moving forward, like, how do we move this needle? I think, again, if I were to summarize, we, 1, need to stay in our lane as providers. We need to recognize that there are creative strategies to help diversify the health professions workforce at various stages in the journey. And 3, we need to have the buy-in and collaborative support of people beyond the academic realm, people beyond the medical profession realm, and we need to try to operationalize some of these things in an evidence-driven way. And if we do that, then we can start to see the needle move. I mean, it's hard in Pittsburgh, for example, where, you know, we've got students who are struggling with truancy and reading. You know, how do we address trying to get them to become physicians when they're not attending school, and when they're in school, they're reading at or below proficient? So that's out of our lane, but it's part of our burden. Because then we can't be frustrated when the students that we see aren't passing their classes. Right? So we have to figure out a way that all of us can work together to help move this needle. Because there are lots of people of color, people in communities of color and diversity and poverty in this community, in the greater Pittsburgh area, who will be the next generation of our health professions workforce, and we need to do our part. So my hope is that we'll do our part here in Pittsburgh to stop the leak. You know, we have a number of kind of simultaneously moving pipeline efforts. And my argument today would be that we need to figure out a way to at least philosophically consolidate and start to move the needle together. I think we all have intellectual experiences that bring value to the conversation, and it would be wonderful for us to be able to work together to make it all happen. So again, I will stop there. If anyone has any questions, you can always reach me offline. But this is an important conversation for us as an organization. Gateway Medical Society is now in its 7th decade of service to the community and service to its members. But this is an important role that at some level we need to fill. And how we do that, that's going to require all of us in this room, as well as all of our colleagues that we know and work with, people that we worship with, et cetera, people that we are neighbors with, to move this needle together. Are there any questions?
Yes, I really do have a question. So you mentioned stay in our lane as providers several times. So I don't feel that I have clarity on what you're saying there with staying in our lane as providers. So you mentioned a scenario where a young person, let's say in the Pittsburgh public school system, but it could be any school system.
Right.
Has difficulty reading, but wants to enter the healthcare professions. So what would be our lane to help that young student as a provider?
So I think, and that's a great question. So I think that our lane would be, while they are working through their school, through their IEP, through their 504, through their tutors and their parents, to improve their ability to read, then we still have a role that we can play. And I think the collaborative piece to that is now going into that engagement space, knowing these issues, we can begin to not only encourage that young person through modeling and conversation, but we're still focusing on medicine. So we're not telling them that because you can't read, you can't be a doctor. We're just simply saying that my job is to keep you motivated to want to be a doctor. I understand now that one of the issues is you're struggling with reading, but don't let that be an impediment to you wanting to be a doctor, versus me trying to figure out how to help you read. There are other people who are out there who could and should be doing that. And so for example, if we were asked to participate in a literacy campaign with limited funds, limited resources, limited staff, limited people, limited time, then our answer should be, that's not our lane. Our lane is not to be part of a literacy program collectively. Our lane would be to, within the framework of the larger literacy issue, to say to those students that reading is an important skill to have, but while you're struggling to learn to read right now, you can still be a doctor. And and that's different, because what happens is we end up getting pulled in all of these different directions, being asked to do all of these things where we're not equipped or prepared or even trained to do. And what gets lost in it is, so if we get pulled into a literacy program, and of the 50 children we encounter, none of them become physicians, then we've used a lot of time to try, which our time is, my argument is, to spend creating more doctors. And now we've used that time to create more readers, when there are other people that could create more readers. We're here to create more doctors. That would be my argument. Because someone else can teach that child to read, but no one else can teach that child the experience of the physician. And so, I mean, I know that there's some gray areas, but I see what often happens is everyone in this room wears multiple hats, and there are lots of asks coming from different directions. And I want to make sure, from an organizational standpoint, that those who are being asked to do are being asked to do in an area of expertise. I think, for example, Gateway Medical Society has established itself as subject matter experts in medicine. And so I think collectively, organizationally, our responsibility is to leverage that expertise in helping shape the pipeline. And we could say, for example, we might say, you know, hey, it's great that you want to partner with us for a pipeline program, but what are you guys doing about helping these kids learn to read? What are you doing about it? You know, they can't go to medical school if they can't read. So we're here to help, we're here to mentor, we're here to encourage, but we're also here to leverage that our expertise, which is, as a health professions expert, I know you can't go to medical school to be a doctor if you can't read at least at or above your grade level. And right now, that would be an example. Yeah, did you have a?
I think you almost answered my question at the end. Because I think we have to be holistic about our approach to our young people. They don't have the resources that other people says. We've already pointed that out. And so trying to find programs is not always easy for them. And even if they can find the programs, they can't get there, they're hungry, I mean, you've given us
Right.
all these things. So sometimes we have to be that program. Sometimes we have to be the one that motivate them to want to read. They may not know why they need to read. And so we do sometimes have to walk more than one lane. I understand saying stay in your lane, but every once in a while we have to walk more than one lane for our children. I don't think we can always say, we have to advocate for our kids, maybe, and I think that's what you were saying at the end, Tyler, that
Right.
we have to be that advocate for our kids because nobody else is going to do it for them.
Right, and I think the way you synopsize it was the way I intended it to be interpreted, which is not that we ignore these very real issues, but that just as an ER doc, I can tell you that your hip is broken, but I'm not taking you to the OR, right? I'm going to stay in my lane. I'm going to leverage my expertise to say this is what you need, and I'm going to direct you to the services that are going to help solve that now issue. So certainly when it comes to, say, literacy or proficiency in math, which is where our children of color in Pittsburgh are struggling to the tune of 18% or so of them are at or below grade level in math, science, and reading, you know, in a school district that has almost $1 billion to teach them. That's a whole other conversation. But I think our discussion is, while we work holistically and collaboratively, well, that's the issue, that right now we're not working collaboratively. Not just us, but in general. We're not working collaboratively. And so what ends up happening is that these issues continue to be unaddressed at multiple levels. And so the collaborative part of that is that we do need to work together. Because just as we do in healthcare, you may find information as a specialist that I didn't find as the PCP, just in how you phrase the question. So you may be the person in the mentorship space that uncovers the reading difficulty that had been labeled a behavior problem, when really the behavior problem is linked to the fact that they can't read. So it's easier to act out in class than to confront the fact that I can't read. And so staying in our lane simply would then be that I'm not a reading specialist. And so I'm going to now mobilize people who have that as their expertise while I'm still mentoring, saying to that child, hey, I know it's frustrating, and I'm not telling you that you can't become a physician. I'm just telling you we need to fix the reading deficit in order to help you become a physician.
You got one more question?
Yes.
A couple.
A couple more.
I'm
Yes.
supposed to be the moderator.
I know.
So we have two more, and then we'll have to do your
And then-
bonus break.
Yes.
So
Yes.
Dr. Timmy and Dr. Lewis.
Thank you, Dr. Constantine.
Can
In
you
that
speak up
phrase,
so the people
in that phrase, stay in your lane, what I'm hearing is a deeper insight to, as a physician, I'm supposed to use my resources to pull together what we have and be able to identify some things in those areas and use my voice in saying, hey, I'm going to do this part, but how about we come together as a group to do this collectively? Like I said, I get deeper insight. More than you will have enough time to break down for me, but thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm going to record what you just said and insert it, because that's exactly what was the intended takeaway from that statement.
Can you repeat it?
There wasn't really a question, it was just an affirmation.
The statement for virtual, because everyone might not hear it.
Okay, so the statement was that what we are to do then is to pull together the resources that these students need to be successful.
You had a question over here.
Yes.
So my question comes off like this, with this being the end of match week, what do we do once we train all of these doctors, but then there's not enough residency spots? And we have all these doctors who can't work in these communities that actually need practicing physicians.
That's an excellent question. The question is, so looking at the match process. So for those online who may not be physicians, match is when medical students get assigned to a residency program for the next several years to continue their training, and that process is called the match. And the question alluded to the fact that there are not enough residency spots, and that many find themselves now not able to get into a residency program, which ultimately impacts the ability to serve and provide care in communities. And that's a great question. And that's an example of staying in our lane organizationally. One of the responsibilities of organizations like Gateway or the NMA or its component and constituent societies, of which Gateway is one, are to leverage our collective expertise and to move the needle in those areas, to be able to say, you know, it's not acceptable for us to have not enough residency programs when we have these glaring inequities and disparities in where care is provided. And so I think some of that sits with the AAMC and the ACGME, but ultimately many of these programs, which are federally subsidized, sit at a higher level of government, our legislative branch of the federal government. But organizations like Gateway, NMA, AMA, and on and on and on really need to begin to start leveraging that expertise that we have to be able to say, we know how many residency spots there needs to be. You all need to figure out how we fund it. That's your job. Our job is to tell you that in order to provide this care, we need these number of providers. And if we don't have these providers, ultimately, it's going to affect the legislative branch differently, because now the health outcomes get worse. That costs more money to take care of sick people. And so our job is to take our expertise and engage people with what we know in order to encourage them to make the appropriate legislative decisions. So, and that's a very valid question. I think that at the medical school level, schools that have diversified their curricula, like I mentioned Brown, creating lanes specifically for people who are aspiring to go into primary care. And, you know, I can't speak for Brown, but I would imagine that their criteria for evaluating applicants is track specific, right? That's not a violation of the 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause, to be able to say that, you know, we have different criteria. I mean, schools already do that now. If you know, but if you have a track, say that's a primary care track, you know that the skill sets that someone going into underserved care and a primary care in an underserved community need, they need to be multilingual, they need to have a heart to serve, they need to have experiential learning in a service space. They're likely to come from those environments where they grew up and where they lived and worked. And so to factor those things into the decision-making for that track also helps you create the appropriate fit for a particular student. So then now you're taking those students and you're better preparing them, making them more likely to match. So I think that the medical school's shared responsibility is to come up with these creative ways of selecting their students without violating the 14th Amendment. Any other questions? I know Dr. Evans, I saw your hand was up earlier, but, okay. Yes, Ms. Sanders.
Not a question, but a comment. As I'm sitting here listening and inspired by what you're saying, sometimes you just drop your bucket where you are. So if there's resource materials that are available and you're seeing patients and you're seeing children, how you doing in school? You know, just ask those questions. And if there's some information that you can give them right there on the spot to help them advance in their careers or the curriculum, then that'll be good. I mean, it's pretty basic stuff. So just
And I-
put that out there.
And I think I love that comment about dropping your bucket where you are, because it speaks to the whole issue of school-based healthcare. And you know, personally, I would love to see within pediatrics and family medicine at some level a school-based health fellowship, because school-based health is where a lot of these issues get discovered and mitigated. Right now, the traditional school-based space is one nurse, outnumbered by 600, 700, 800 students, burdened by a bunch of state-regulated paperwork, which keeps him or her away from their clinical duties, and that paperwork is largely beneath their skill set. But if you can create a school-based health space where now you put in an advanced practice nursing professional and a licensed clinical social worker to work in concert with the school nurse, now you are bringing these resources that help uncover all that below the surface stuff and develop strategies to mitigate it. So for example, if you had a kid that had a lot of trauma-informed issues, but is bright, the current dynamic is they have an IEP or a 504, they get resourced out to outpatient behavioral health services, which Dr. Salahuddin can tell you that unless you are coming directly from WIPIC, it could take a whole school year before they even see a therapist. But if you can bring the therapist in the building as part of a school-based health model, now that child is beginning to get the services that they need well in advance, which helps us help them in this journey to what it is they want to be, whether it's a physician or anyone. But school-based, that is, I believe, a critical issue in how we begin to fortify the pipeline, is bringing these services to these children as early in their education as we can and as often as we can.
Okay,
think we're-
let's
yeah.
give Dr. Conti a great big round of applause for this wonderful presentation. Just a quick question for our program. We're a little bit behind, but we're going to catch up. Don't worry about it. So instead of your 10-minute wellness break, I would like everybody to stand up, move around, stretch. We're going to ask that the speakers for our next session come on up to the podium, and we're going to catch up. Thank you. Yes, take 5 minutes, and then we'll begin. Come on, return to their seats. We're going to get started. And just for a program edit, you're going to be sitting for a little while because we're not going to take a wellness break between this session and our next session to catch up. So if we could all come to our seats and get ready for the next session, which is building your wellness and self-care toolkit for navigating bias, discrimination, and systemic racism. Woo, woo, woo. Okay, our presenter today, one of our speakers had a family emergency, Dr. Hughey, so she won't be here. We have Dr. Daniel Salahuddin, who I am so pleased to see today, who is now Assistant Professor, Department of Family Medicine, University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. We drafted Daniel during the pandemic, and I just came to love this young man. We were blessed to have him, and he did a lot of our COVID-19 educational outreach, along with Dr. Stephanie Miller. See, if you come into the Gateway Medical Society as a, quote, younger physician compared to us, we're going to kind of bring you in gradually. But we'd like to have you share your expertise broadly and widely. And Daniel, he went to the Pittsburgh Public Schools for us. He was on a lot of our internet outreach through with One Hood Media. So I came to really appreciate Daniel's expertise, along with Dr. Tony, along with Dr. Miller, and everybody that worked with us. So thank you. And we're so proud to have Dr. Salutin talk to us about how to keep ourselves sane in these crazy environments that we find ourselves in.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Salutin.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, for the kind introduction. Thank you all so much for being here today. Really happy to engage in this conversation with you. So, I mean, when I was initially approached about this topic, it's like navigating bias, structural racism, just all the things, you know. So it's like we'll do that in an hour, right? We'll do that in an hour. No big deal. So. What I'm hoping to leave you with today is more so just a way to start thinking about some of these things, hopefully leave you with some of these skills, but I'm sure that a lot of you are already incorporating in your life, but just want to start a conversation, a conversation that we don't have too often, I think, in our space and everything like that, but that really contributes to our overall sense of wellness as healthcare professionals. So this actually dovetails really nicely into from what we were talking about and discussing in the last talk with Dr. Conti. And so the way I was conceptualizing it is, there's daunting work ahead of us. And so, there's everywhere you're looking, left, right, forward, backward, there's forces of oppression that are constantly, we make some progress, but then kind of status quo for this country is that there are always going to be forces that are trying to halt and actively remove that progress. And so the perfect example of that is with the recent Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action. And so, this is nothing new. This is nothing that we have not encountered before in our history. And so what we need to do is continue moving forward in a way that's most consistent with our values. And so one of my big things I want to talk about today is how do we move forward in this landscape when we have so many forces that are honestly like oftentimes can make it very difficult to do our jobs, And so, you hear about this a lot. We think about whenever on an airplane, they say, please put your mask on if there is, in case of emergency, depressurization or whatever the case, please put your mask on before others. And I always go back to that because I think it's so important. And Dr. Conti, you alluded to this as well. It's really hard. You can't take care of other people if you're not taking care of yourself. And so I think it's really important that we really have an honest conversation about how do we take care of ourselves as Black healthcare professionals. And so I want this to be interactive, so there's a microphone right here that we can pass around. And so, without further ado, so one of the things that I want to do to kind of get the conversation started off is, we all work in different variety of healthcare settings. What is it that you all feel misses the mark when it comes to wellness? Because I feel like that's a buzzword that's really like tossed out around a lot. And I think that we've gotten to a point now where when we hear wellness, a lot of us just like roll our eyes and are just like, okay, yeah, whatever, like thank you for the pizza at lunch. Thank you for the forced wellness, is what they call it a lot. And so, yeah, I'm just curious from your perspectives, how do wellness initiatives get it right, and how do you feel like they're missing the mark? So I'll open up the floor with that question.
I'm glad you mentioned that wellness is being used as a buzzword. I really feel we're missing the mark by not specifically saying that wellness really can be encapsulated encapsulated in a different word, and I think that word is belonging. And I really feel that should be our emphasis, because when we as professionals in whatever our space is feel that we belong and have value, that's where our well-being rises. Does anybody agree or disagree with that?
Absolutely. 100%, yeah. Belonging and feeling like you're part of a valued member of the community and that you're part of the culture, I think is so, so incredibly important, because otherwise it honestly can ring hollow. You know, a lot of these wellness initiatives, it's like, do you really care about us? Because we're all pretty intuitive, perceptive individuals. You know, I think that we get a sense when people are, for lack of a better term, being fake. And so, like, I think that a lot of times we feel that way about our employers, and that can lead to feelings. I think that ultimately, at the end of the day, when I think of wellness, there's just so many different levels to it, and I think that you're right, it misses the mark in terms of that word is too overly simplistic. It doesn't capture exactly what it is that is happening. So.
Thank you for that, Dr. Stevens. I think there is a cognitive disconnect regarding the motivations surrounding wellness when it comes to our employers. That disconnect, trying to leverage your skill set to care for individuals is one thing, but that requires time and energy and money.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And so there is that disconnect within the healthcare systems, because beyond, if I need to give my providers, my workforce more time for mental health to be able to gather themselves, that is less time away from patient care, that is less time away from generating revenue. And so we find ourselves oftentimes within our healthcare system battling that. So yes, the pizza at lunch is great, but what I really need is maybe an hour to walk away to go speak with my therapist. Will you grant me that? And oftentimes the answer is no, or you have to use your own PTO time, but enjoy the pizza. So, we're talking about that disconnect within our healthcare system. So, when we're talking about developing skills, how do we navigate that? I always find that I'm fighting against, there are much larger forces above me that are preventing me from caring for myself personally, even though we love using that buzzword. But until those systems say, yes, we do value you, and this is how we're going to show that we value you, by giving you the time and the resources that you need to do your job, we're never going to make much headway when it comes to the realm of wellness within physicians. We're just going to be asked to do more.
Exactly. Asked to do more with less. Mm-hmm. And always made to feel like whatever it is you're doing is not enough.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for this presentation. I agree with the expressed sentiments. I think another thing is boundaries. I think one of the things for us to be well is we need to be able to have time for us to disconnect, to refresh, to restore, be filled up. And I have found that it seems like there's just a lot of habitual line steppers. You try to put boundaries in there, like, oh, people want you to respond to emails at all hours of the day, text messages, calls from, people want you to answer instantly if a patient calls, right? So I think we are trying to generate this environment of wellness, but they also want our work to extend throughout the entire day. And that's kind of hard to do sometimes. So I think they're focused on wellness, but they are not focused on, okay, let's put in this supplemental support mechanisms that we need so that we can maintain boundaries too.
Absolutely.
I'm going to carry that forward in terms of boundaries. Because I really do feel like wellness is boundaries. We are parents. We are children of elderly parents. We have our own medical issues that we have to take time away from work. And I think it's very important for any organization that we're a part of to recognize that at any point in given time, we are also patients
Mm-hmm.
and have people who are loved ones who are patients, and that we should be given the same protections as we try to provide our patients. And it doesn't have to be, it's a culture shift, I think. Because what I do like about my practice is that when I was on medical leave at a very busy part of the year, because everybody's trying to get their colonoscopy in because they've met their deductible, there were patients who were like, well, where is she? And luckily, I had nurses and staff that defended me,
Mm-hmm.
that she's on medical leave. We will get you scheduled.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to build a culture of protecting each other's boundaries. And
Absolutely.
to also say that we are human and we have to have rest to do our best.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
For me, wellness means not feeling the burden of the race. Most of us still, according to these statistics that Chris put on the board, are first. Unfortunately, in 2024, there's still a lot of us that are first. We're the first ones in our department.
Mm-hmm.
We might be the first Black pediatric orthopedic surgeon in Pittsburgh, Dr. Amanda McCoy. Dr. Stephen Evans, for how many years, was the only Black trauma surgeon and the only Black oncology surgeon in Pittsburgh. I don't know if Dr. Rachel Toney is the only Black gastroenterologist. She's the only one I know. But, and for many years, I was the only Black medical director in the space I was in. That burden of the race,
Mm-hmm.
as I call it, because you know that your performance will break or make others behind you.
Mm-hmm.
If we fail, nobody else comes through the door. And that's just a reality. But there aren't any supporting institutions for us. That whole community of support, for many years, all we had was each other. The folks that are in this room,
Right.
we supported one another. So until we foster that pipeline that you were talking about, so that there's more of us to have that community, or either we strengthen the community that exists, the fragile little community that we have through opportunities like this, I think wellness is still an idea.
Absolutely.
Because there's too many things that keep us away from being well in the spaces that we're in. And I just want to say that I know a lot of us are physicians in the room, but we also have nurses in the room. So I want to encourage you to feel that you have a voice in this session today, because you're working side by side with us in these institutions. And we know that you experience very similar things to what we
Absolutely.
experienced too. So that's my
Yeah. It's exhausting to feel like you are constantly justifying your existence. That's what it comes down to at the end of the day. Because you, again, in the context of everything that we were talking about with these new affirmative action rulings, the implicit message in here is in these rulings is you don't belong here. And so, especially now, if you are one of the few in the spaces that you occupy, now you're like, to your point, Dr. Johnson, I'm a representative for my entire race. People are going to look at me, and when they see me and my performance, they're going to make snap judgments about all of us. And that's too much for one person to handle. It's not fair. So that speaks to an additional layer when it comes to the whole wellness conversation about these systemic factors, this systemic racism that we experience on a day-to-day level, and that also that duality of not only being Black in America, but also being a representative of the healthcare institution that has committed a lot of atrocities to our community. And so I think holding those two truths at the same time can oftentimes be really difficult because, again, there's so many dynamics at play from peer to peer, from you and patients, higher management, upper levels, employers, system, whatever you want to refer to that as. And so when you take a moment to really break that down, it's no wonder that, wellness is something that is so necessary to really grapple over and keep your mind on at all times because it's so it's prevalent all the time.
I had a question.
Yeah.
We spoke about it a little bit in preparation, but it was also mentioned by in one of the other questions about therapy for physicians and nurses. Inherently in communities of color, that's often, it's a stigma. We don't share our business, we keep our stuff to ourselves. And even when you ascend to a level of being a health professional, educated, academically trained, that's still part of who you are. And I don't know if you know any statistical data about therapy being used by health professionals in general, and is there a disparity in that realm when you look at, say, health professionals of color, women versus men, and the use of therapy? Because that's a very real and, as you know, legitimate therapeutic modality to help you achieve wellness. So I just was hoping you could speak to the whole therapy.
Absolutely. And we can definitely transition, just being mindful of the time, we can transition to what we can do about it. We've named the challenges, we've named these barriers and challenges. So let's transition to what is it that we can do about this. So to your point about therapy, I do not have statistics, unfortunately, but I'll be happy to look those up and circle back because I think that would be very interesting. Anecdotally, I would imagine, I would say that the following trends are what I've observed. I think therapy has become a lot more normalized in the last 10 years. I think that even when I was in college, undergrad, longer than that, it was something that was not really much part of the public discourse and everything like that. So I think that there have been a lot of different reasons as to why therapy has become more normalized. And I think specifically among health professionals, there's a lot more conversations about having it be okay to, not even be okay, having it be encouraged to seek therapy. And I think one of the big differences that's taken place, one of the big shifts, has been people, I think this could also be generational, because when I was telling my mom that I was in therapy several years ago, which I still continue to do to this day, by the way, so I was telling her I was doing therapy, and her first question to me was, "What's wrong?" And so I think that is starting to shift in terms of the perception as well, that there needs to always be something wrong, a presenting issue for there to be therapy. More often than not, that there usually is. If you dig deep enough, there will be some stuff. But I think by and large, if you tell somebody you're doing therapy, then that's not going to necessarily be received as oh dang, something's really, really going on with them. It's no, this is just maintenance. This is something I do to maintain my wellness. But we can't talk about therapy without talking about the significant barriers to accessing therapy. I think that there are, especially since COVID, there's such a shortage of therapists, and unfortunately not all therapists are created equal. There are going to be some therapists that you resonate with more than others, and that's going to be due to interpersonal dynamics. But also, there's a drastic shortage of Black and brown therapists. Certainly not enough to fill the need. I wish that I had all therapists on Pocket Dial or not Pocket, what am I talking about? On Speed Dial, on Speed Dial that I could refer patients I see to because there's just not necessarily the need, and then there's a lot of barriers in that sense. But that's a whole other conversation. This is more talking about like physician wellness. So what has been, if you feel comfortable, what has been everyone here's experience in terms of navigating therapy, or I guess also like to the point about perceptions towards therapy? Like, how have you seen that change? Is it happening that it's still kind of frowned upon in the workplace if you were to bring it up? Not that that's anybody's business, but like just generally, culturally, like how have you seen that shift, if at all? And I'm curious to hear if you have not seen that shift.
Okay, so in sort of my experience and sort of my background, I have noticed a shift towards more of an acceptance towards therapy, especially in my younger generation.
Mhm.
And I attribute that a lot to social media. There's a lot more exposure now than there was, 10, 20 years ago. Our young people use Facebook and TikTok and all sorts of ways to communicate. And that has really opened an avenue for them to really express, I may be struggling with this. And people have that exposure. And when you have that exposure, you can normalize that conversation, that this is something that you can do.
Mhm.
This is something that is accepted. Before our older, my parents' generation, they didn't have that interaction with each other.
Right.
You're confined to your community, you're confined to your family unit. That's how the ideas were exchanged. And so if within that unit, therapy was frowned upon, you grew up feeling that.
Mhm.
Now, our young people can challenge that perception, and they can communicate with each other, and they can see other people that look like them, their age, talking about the very issues that they're struggling with. And so that is the transition that I have seen. And I know COVID has shown a light and has affected the workforce, and we are losing therapists. But one thing I think that I am actually, I want to say grateful for, but there's been an opening, an avenue to actually discuss and find a therapist without physically being in the room with them. I think virtual therapy and using that mechanism to be able to talk to someone has actually expanded access in a way that I don't think would have been possible without the pandemic.
Yeah.
Because our infrastructure for telemedicine, for telehealth, did not exist,
Mhm.
or was very little, right? And then within a short period of time, because of the pandemic, we had to scale up that technology. We had to scale up those resources. And that has allowed people now to actually find therapists that they can speak with
Mhm.
without physically having to get there.
Yeah.
Because transportation could be a barrier for our patients
Yeah.
as well. And then little known legislation, I don't know, but I think that's going to be coming down from Medicare, is sort of like that support, allowing mental health professionals to communicate with patients without physically being in the same state, which was a barrier before the pandemic. You could not provide care across state lines. But with the change in the pandemic and the public health exception, they eliminated that barrier. And it's still in place now that allows therapists to communicate with individuals across state lines. That's one of the caveats right now with telehealth. So
Yeah.
we're moving towards opening access. And so I'm encouraged by these changes, and that the government has recognized that, hey, physical interaction is a barrier for people. So let us diversify our method of delivering care
Mhm.
through telehealth.
Right.
And I'm encouraged. I think it's going to open and allow other individuals to be able to access therapy without physically being there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I agree. I think therapy is definitely becoming more of the mainstream dialogue for our young people. So I'm a clinical skills preceptor in the medical school, so I teach first-year medical students on medical interviewing and physical exam. And just from my interactions with our first years at Pitt, I can tell that the mental health is definitely in their awareness. People talk about it. I get emails from medical students saying, I'm not feeling this. We talk about how when we do mock interviews with the standardized patients, we talk about our emotions. And you say what's this pulling up in us? What's this bringing to our attention? What are we feeling? Where are we feeling it? So I think definitely it's penetrating the younger generations, and even with the residents. I read residency applications for Pitt, and even reading personal statements. I saw people tell us about their traumas. They're even asking about it in ARIS now, like what unforeseen circumstances did you have to get over? And so people are talking about it. However, I still think we're still far away. So I have my own occupation disability insurance, right? And when I sign my little form for my own occupational disability insurance, it says it covers everything except mental health crisis.
Yep.
Right? And so we're not there yet. We're definitely not near parity.
Absolutely.
But I think we're moving forward.
Yeah. I'm so happy you brought that up, because I was just thinking about, as I was finishing up residency, they were selling us on this disability insurance to supplement what comes with your employer and everything like that. And, obviously these things, they parse through all your medical records and everything like that. And one of the things that came up as a flag, because there's like two pathways. There's the one, like if you're pretty low risk, then you have obviously lower monthly payments and everything, more coverage, etc. But if everything flags, then they have this thing, another slot that they put you in, which is what the big selling point was of like this universal thing where it's like basically no questions asked if you're a certain, etc. Anyway, the fact that I was in therapy flagged, and so as a result, I had to be redirected and diverted, even though there was nothing else necessarily going on. And that was a big eye-opening moment for me, because I'm like, oh wow, this is something that I didn't even think twice about, but that just shows that the stigma is still so real. So one of the things that Dr. Huey and I were discussing when formulating this session and everything like that is, taking back power within the workplace. I think that when we take a look at a lot of things that are responsible for feelings of burnout, moral injury, whatever you want to call it, we listed all these factors that are really driving that. But one of the things that we came up with that really, I think, speaks to the crux of why we often feel that way is, I think, a general sense of powerlessness in a lot of situations. I think that when we have more control and autonomy within the work that we're doing and the decisions that are being made, and to your points about maintaining boundaries and everything like that, that's when we feel most fulfilled with our job. So I was wondering, what were your thoughts on that idea of maintaining power, maintaining that locus of control, and what are some things that you all have done that have been helpful for you to maintain that sense of balance?
That's actually a very loaded question, but I remember in residency feeling the pressures and not knowing exactly what boundaries were. Somehow I got involved with AMWA, and from there I was able to find out about their leadership coaching. And I just got myself a leadership coach, because there was no way I was going to be the only African American female in the place and struggling. I had a lot of challenges. That's being on an entire floor and being the only one, and being written up for every single thing. You breathe, you're written up. So just being in that environment alone, I felt like I needed leadership coaching.
Yeah.
And that's why I learned about boundaries now. So now in practice, I'm at a practice where I am the only one. I am the only provider there of color. I can say we do have another MP, and we have a couple of staff members that are minority over there. But I see myself pulling from my tool bag right now about everything I've learned about boundaries and pulling them out, and that helps me maintain. There's nothing like wellness in my workplace right now. But when I understand what my boundaries are, and I understand that they're healthy. I understand who Tammy is.
Mhm.
That helps me stand every day and do what I need to do, care for my patients and still go home. But of course, there's still challenges along the way, right? So boundaries is constantly evolving.
Right.
This is a great conversation, and I'm struck by the fact, first of all, for people who don't know me, I know a lot of people in the room. I'm Elise Roby Anders. I'm a certified financial planner at Merrill Bank of America, and I'm the financial advisor for the NMA. First only for so long, and you all will be hearing from my colleague Maya Moore-Irick later on today, so glad to have some company in this journey, where we've been the only one. But yesterday, one of our colleagues committed suicide. And it just, hurt my heart. I mean, we're in such a pressurized environment. And that consequence of that pressure, there may have been some other extenuating factors that I am not aware of, but that manifests itself in a obviously very, very negative way. So I think in terms of setting boundaries is to have a support system that you put in place, your own personal support system. It can be friends, it can be a church environment, but seek those out. It is so important so that you can move forward in this journey called life, irrespective of the medical profession, and get the therapy if that's what you need in your support system, but just get a support system.
Mhm.
Don't let it come to that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's always devastating to hear when people die by suicide, because you always ask yourself, like, oh, like, what did I miss? Were there any signs? Could I have helped? And it's a really dark place to be, to the point where you are at that point where you feel like that's the only option, and so it certainly leaves ripple effects throughout the community as well. So sending condolences to everyone impacted for you.
I'm really glad to hear that some of our younger physicians are engaged in therapy. I think that's wonderful. I recommend it. I come from a generation where you didn't even know about therapy.
Mm-hmm.
As a person who came from, I'll just say, disenfranchised background, to make it easier, this therapy wasn't, what was therapy? We didn't have that option. But faith became my therapy, and that's how I've managed to cope through all of my adversity, through my faith. But like Elise said, I think finding a support system. I remember one moment when I had high-risk pregnancies, and I had to be hospitalized for all of my pregnancies. And someone came to me and they said, "Do you have any hobbies?" And I said, "Yeah, I like to read." "That doesn't count," she said. "Do you have any hobbies? What do you do? Do you do any kind of artwork, needlepoint, knitting, crocheting?" And I was thinking, I'm a doctor, I don't have time for any of that. I might have did that when I was in high school, but I don't have time to knit, crochet. My whole point is find a hobby. Keep a hobby. Something that you can go to. I remember one of our great physicians, Dr. Jeanette Southpaw. She's retired. But she went everywhere with her knitting bag and her needles. And if you saw Dr. Southpaw anywhere outside of her white coat and seeing patients, she always had her knitting needles. So my one advice is to have a hobby. That helps you stay anchored in terms of your wellness strategy.
Absolutely.
Mine is to find your support system. And you talked about staying in your lane. That's one thing we can do for, as older physicians who have traveled the road and the journey that you are on. Use us. Please use us. Because we can be that lifeline for you when you're in crisis. There's probably not a single situation that you will experience that one of us in this room has not gone through. I'm not a surgeon. I can't tell you how to get through the operating room, but Dr. Evans can. So I encourage you to, before you leave, remember I stood up there and asked you to write one thing down. And I changed my assignment for myself to create an action plan of one thing I was going to do today. But I'm going to encourage all of you to find one person today, if you're here today, find one person that you can turn to whenever you have a crisis. Use us. We're not, it's not far from our memories. And it doesn't have to be an older person, it can be a younger person, it could be your peer. But find that person of support. When I worked for a corporation, they used to always say, do you have a best friend in your workplace? Do you have a best friend in your workplace? If you can't create one in your workplace, get one in your life. And have another physician too that's in that box. Or another nurse, another therapist, another psychiatrist, whatever space that you're in, find that person and develop that relationship. It takes time to develop relationships because we're mothers, we're wives, we're sisters, we're daughters, we've got elderly parents. It takes time. But there is no better investment than the time you can put into for yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that whole idea of finding things that keep you grounded are so important when we talk about building up a wellness toolkit. Because when life gets increasingly busy and you feel like you're starting to kind of lose your sense of self, those are going to be the things that you can turn to that really are good reminders of like, all right, I'm okay. I'm okay, you know, this moment will pass. What's more important, the most important thing I would argue in that moment is you continuing to feel like yourself. One of the things that that's in my wellness toolkit personally is during summer of 2020 when there was a lot of, conversations involving like race in this country and obviously the pandemic. It was a very loaded time, as we all remember, you know. I started feeling myself feeling a little bit more on edge and tense and like grappling with a little bit more anxiety than I usually was experiencing. And so I turned to, there was this free benefit for healthcare providers for the Headspace app. And so I was like, shoot, let me try this. Like I was still in therapy at that time, but I tried meditating. And meditation has been such an incredible force in my life since that point. You know, I think that it's a really valuable thing. But again, what works for me is not going to work for you. It's not going to work for somebody else. So I think it's really important to really see what works for you, whether that be movement, whether that be connecting with loved ones, whether that be taking time for yourself to journal, reflect. I think all of those things are equally important and are going to work in different moments within life. So curious, what are some other things within you guys' toolkits that you feel like have really helped?
I'll just segue off of what Dr. Johnson mentioned, because I do remember Dr. Southpaw, and one of the things that she created for her peers as well as for herself was this group of professional women who would meet on a regular basis, usually at her home. I just remember that's at least how it was explained by my wife. But she would always talk about how invigorating it was to just spend time with other women professionals, not to talk about the profession, but just to talk, about whatever. It just organically became whatever. But so it's not my personal toolkit, but I know that it was one that she found great value in. And when that went away, when Dr. Southpaw retired, there was almost like a separation kind of trauma there, because she had come to really appreciate that space and that time. It wasn't something that they felt obligated that every time they were going to meet that you had to be there, but it was just knowing it was there
And those organic relationships that developed from that group that she then formed with other individual women, she just found it very, very empowering for her. So, I don't know if such a group exists now, but I know that that experience was very impactful for my wife.
Absolutely.
I will say this, trying to bring it back.
And Dr. Softball is a good friend of mine. She's unsuccessfully retired. So keeping busy. She's at Fisk, I believe, right now, and doing some work there. But anyway, long story short is I exercise. Dr. Johnson saw me leaving one of the Gateway Medical luncheons, and I was on my bike. And she's like, wow. And I was like, I've got to keep moving. I think that mind-body connection is very important as well.
Absolutely.
So I'd encourage everybody to, meditation, yoga, find some physical outlet for some of the mental stress that you're under.
Yeah. Wrapping up soon.
Okay, well, let's give Dr. Daniel Salutin a big round of applause. We thank him for this session.
We are so close to being back on time, so we are going to get started.
We will get us there.
Mindful of the time you spent on your Saturday. Again, thank you to Dr. Salutin for what he brought to the conversation. And please go into this with the mindset that this is not a one and done thing. We are looking to have these provider symposia throughout the year. So if you have specific subject matter topics, either you feel expert in talking about or you would just like to hear more about, please let us know so that we can incorporate those into the future programming. So now we're going to shift. We talked about the pipeline, we talked about wellness with our air quotes, and now we're going to talk about wealth matters. And again, it's from the standpoint of there are issues that are very real and they ultimately impact our wellness and then can ultimately impact what we carry into our workplaces. And we have very unique workplaces where people are literally putting their lives in our hands, and we want to be undistracted. And so, again, I want to welcome, see now it's in my head when you're talking about it, Maya Irick. I was so close to saying what you said. Maya Irick and Shiv Sethi, who are going to talk to us today about wealth and the wealth gap that exists. You would think that after all these years of training, whether you're a physician or a nurse, and all the delayed gratification, and you watched your colleagues who you grew up with and went to college with, they've got their first house, and they've got this, and they've got that, and you're still going to the mailbox with dread because you know it's still a student loan invoice. You think with all of that, we would not have to talk about a wealth gap in 2024, but in fact we do. So I'm going to turn it over to them first for introductions, and then we'll start with the conversation.
Oh, okay, great. Again, thank you so much for having us. We're really excited to be having this conversation. I promise that everything is not dreary when it comes to wealth for Black and brown professionals, healthcare professionals in particular. I'm Maya Moore Irick. I'm the founder of the Irick Group. We are a private wealth team at Merrill, which is part of Bank of America. I'm joined today by my partner, Shiv Sethi. We founded our team with the core values of respect, empathy, and inclusion. This was very important to us. We both have worked at other firms in other parts of the country and locally in Pittsburgh. What we discovered is that the wealth journey looks really unique for our community, right? But there hasn't been a change in terms of what the advisors look like. They're helping us be stewards of that wealth. So it was really, really important for us to build a team that looked, different than the rest of Wall Street, but really to help democratize access to wealth management. We are not the first in our industry space. You've already heard from Elise Yonder. She's one of our colleagues also at Merrill, and she's been in the industry for quite some time as well. So there are a few of us. but this is the problem. There are just a few of us. And there's not enough of us kind of leaning in to do this work to make sure that our communities understand and we can address how we can overcome this wealth gap. So again, our team is located here physically in Pittsburgh, but our clients are all over the country, and we really help professionals just like you get a better understanding of how they can kind of eliminate this gap. So I don't know if you wanted to.
No, I think Maya did a really good introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I think as Maya mentioned, I would just emphasize this one point. We realize that the pathways and attitudes towards wealth have been changing pretty drastically over the last 20, 30 years. And having a team that's more reflective of those pathways and attitudes was important to us. And so that's why we kind of built this venture from the ground up, and we're excited to share whatever knowledge we've accumulated over the last couple of years here with all of you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you guys again for taking time out of your Saturday to share with us. So we'll jump right in. You know, we hear a lot about all kinds of gaps, care gaps and this gap and that, but there is a very real wealth gap as it relates to professionals of color. Can you share with us any data that you have that kind of speaks to maybe that in general and then among the health professions specifically?
So for everyone who's very familiar with Dr. Conti, you know that he loves statistics and numbers, as do I, right? My background's in math. So I'm just going to share a few with you. But the other thing I think to keep in mind is that while some of these are sobering, this is not our reality, and this is not going to be the tone of the rest of our conversation. Like we don't want to be negative per se, because everything from here, we only can move forward, right, as a community. So according to the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances, and this may be a statistic that's familiar to a lot of you, for a typical white family, a white family has 8 times the wealth of a typical black family and 5 times the wealth of a typical Hispanic family, right? So, you know, that number is pretty ridiculous for lots of different reasons. But when we drill down even deeper into the healthcare professional space, when we think about, you know, the black and brown community and healthcare professionals, according to the National Institute of Health, when we look at where black and brown professionals are lying, they're underpaid, right? They're having these lower paying jobs, they're at lower positions and at less prestigious institutions. And I saw who's going to be speaking after us. We already saw who spoke before us. This is not necessarily the case in Pittsburgh, but when we look at it from a mass population, this is a problem, right? So how can we continue to get to these positions where we're in specialties that are paying more, where there are more of us, not just one of us, but more of us in these higher paying jobs at these prestigious institutions, because part of this is our wealth journey. The more we're accumulating now in our day-to-day, this is going to help only snowball our families forward when we think about wealth. So I'm not going to say any more negative statistics, okay? Now we're only going to be moving forward. I actually will never like to set the tone with negative statistics at the beginning, but I'm doing what I'm asked from Dr. Conti. So now for the positive. And I love the fact that there are so many women of color in the room, because I think that the future is very bright for us. When we go to the National Center for Education Statistics, it is showing that the highest demographic of those that are being educated from a post-secondary college position are black women, right? In troves, we are now taking over academia, and that is amazing. From the same survey, they found that 65% of doctoral degrees, dental degrees, medical degrees, graduate degrees are coming from black females, 65%. So I think, if anything, that should give us so much hope. But that's just the beginning, right? The education piece is just the beginning of how we address this wealth gap. There are lots of steps that go beyond just getting that degree. So we're going to talk a lot about some of those today. And then just one other thing I'll share. 2 years ago, Shiv and I and Elise were all very familiar with this study. We did a study called Diverse Viewpoints. Merrill unrolled it, and we studied wealth in black, brown, Asian communities, and also the LGBT communities. And what we found is that, in particular for black and brown families, generational wealth was so important. The education was there. We just didn't know how to find the right providers to kind of support us on the journey. And those providers aren't just financial advisors. Those providers are also people like accountants, attorneys, recruiters, other people that are going to help you accumulate that wealth. So we have the hunger, we have the mindset. It's just like, how do we bridge that gap?
And again, Yes, I love statistics. So with taking those statistics into account, both the negative and the positive, so what are some things that you and your team as financial or wealth managers, certified financial consultants, what do you do to help your clients? I guess maybe to start with, because we can't assume that either everyone in this room or those watching on Zoom or YouTube or wherever even know what a certified financial advisor is. So I guess that question first, and then what are the things that you do to help your clients?
Well, do we want to talk maybe a little bit, we'll answer that question, but would it help to kind of understand now, you know, we have this wealth gap, we know what these statistics are, like, what has it actually done to our community? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the effects of the wealth gap are many, but really the biggest impact is that it exacerbates other existing inequities. The big one is education. So typically, for families that don't have financial resources early in life, we see worsening education outcomes for their children later on. And that's something that can persist for a long time. The other thing that really arises from the wealth gap is a lack of capital and investment, particularly in minority communities. This has been a big problem in the United States for a long time. There's been some legislation recently around that to try to fix it to a bit, you know, economic zones, things like that, banks being more active in putting capital in communities that are primarily minority. But those things take a long time to show effect. And so communities that have been starved for capital for a long time, unfortunately, have felt that effect. And that's something that, as a society, we need to address. Financial advisors, non-financial advisors, people in every field, investing in communities that historically have not received capital. Capital really is the lifeblood of growth. Interestingly, one of the things our team did a few years ago is we hosted a boot camp for founders, or early stage founders, underrepresented founders, and taught them ways that they could access different streams of capital, how to think about expanding their businesses, how to connect them with other industry experts, things like that. Those are small things that I think we can do to try to close that gap. But I think capital and investment into communities that have historically not received it is the best thing we can do as a society. Education is a longer thing to fix. That also relates to capital, but early on, making sure that families are financially comfortable early on in life to have the right right educational resources for their children. So these type of things take a long time to close the gap. I think Maya will talk a little bit about what we're doing more as a team, but those are really the main impacts of the wealth gap.
And it's interesting that you mentioned the education, because as we were talking earlier this morning about the pipeline and how now with the recent Supreme Court decisions about no longer being able to use race as a factor for admission as well as financial aid and scholarships, that issue is going to become even more important, because now you see the Facebook posts about so-and-so who grew up in this community got this many scholarships. Well, those scholarships may not be available anymore. And so now that lack of wealth will become an impediment and promote, in developing this generational desire to be higher educated. So I'm glad that you mentioned.
One thing I would add onto that is that there's also a lagging impact for, inequitable access to training. So forget just education. Oftentimes, if you're a minority employee and you get into a company, there's not a support system around you to make sure that you can succeed. So a lot of great work that Maya and Elise do at our own company around the Black Professional Group is trying to create these support systems that when you do have minority employees joining the firm, that they know that there's a support system and guardrails around them, that they know where to go to find resources, and that they're set up to succeed in the workplace.
So, we mentioned the gap and the impact. So now, the question is the solutions. And I would imagine that you, just as we as healthcare providers, would not encourage your clients to rely solely on the internet for their empowering knowledge base. Granted, there is some truth to some of it, but that's why there are people like you and Shiv and Elise to help us. So what are the things that you do? How do you help us?
So there are three main key things that, in terms of how to address this gap, where we see most common that we're giving coaching to Black and brown professionals, specifically in the healthcare space, that I'll share with you today. But I will say the access to financial information that is on the internet now, especially the younger professionals that we meet that have learned a bunch from personal finance experts on TikTok and whatnot, is truly amazing. So there really is no excuse for any of us to not Google the term, some term that we don't know, right? Information's becoming more readily available. So I would say that that's a positive thing. And that's going to almost act as an equalizer for us to be able to access this information. But the three things that we've seen intended to help our clients when it comes to growing their wealth and kind of not being that statistic. The first in particular, that's why I'm so thankful that we were after the wellness session, is directly related to that. If you don't have a strong understanding of what your why is and what you want your money to do and act as a tool for you, and you haven't targeted those goals and aspirations, like that's a huge problem, right? Because wealth is relative. What Dr. Conti may need to support his family may look very different than what I need to support mine. My financial goals might look very different than his. So ultimately, it's spending time with our clients, helping them understand their why, their goal and aspirations, and creating a plan for that, right? How are you going to use the money resources you have now to actually execute on that plan? So that's the first. The second thing, and this is so key for our community, is being able to negotiate. So we role play, sometimes with people that aren't even our clients, to help them identify how they're going to make that ask to make sure they're getting their money. And when I say money, I'm not just talking about the base salary. That's a small component to your overall compensation, especially as you're moving on your journey, right? That would be things like understanding, this is a big one with a client recently, tuition remission for medical school for their adult child, right? That's they didn't want to leave their job because that's a huge part of their compensation. That might be your 403B, 401k match. That might be access to healthcare services for your own family, even though you work in the profession. So there's lots of other components to your overall compensation, and being able to understand how to negotiate throughout your journey. And if you don't do it early on, it's this snowball effect of that you're just going to continue to make less. That is so critical. So the first is understanding your why, helping to execute a plan around that. The second is the negotiation, compensation tactics, right? Getting a handle on that, because that has this overarching long-term effect. And the third is we spend a lot of time meeting our clients where they are. It doesn't matter if you're at the beginning or if you're at the end of your career or wherever you are, we spend a lot of time on making sure each and every client is an informed consumer. This is so critical for us. We get at the table and we're going to have these negotiation conversations, or you're going to come into a large financial institution like ours and you don't know the basic terms, you are going to be at a disadvantage. So we're trying to make sure you're armed with information, you're an informed consumer, right? You should never spend, invest, save in any type of product that you do not understand how it functions, ever, period, right? And so this is really, really important. So part of this helping you build your wealth is with those three things. Your why, having a plan for it. Negotiation and your compensation, right? Making sure you know how to ask for money. I practice all of the time. I think Shiv is probably sick of this. My husband's absolutely sick of this because I'm constantly negotiating with him in the household around stuff, right? Because equity begins in the home. Dr. Conti knows my husband. It's a real thing. But we're also modeling these negotiation tactics with our family, with our children, right? They're watching every single thing that we're doing. So are our colleagues. If you're not negotiating for yourself, how are you going to expect to be able to be a champion for that next Black or brown professional that's coming up and help them get their money? So those three things, I think, are kind of the most important things just from a wealth creation standpoint. Obviously, today we're going to go into details of a number of other tactics we use, but I think from a baseline, those are really, really critical.
So you mentioned the whole concept of a wealth plan. Can you talk more about that?
So many of you probably call it a financial plan. I call it a wealth plan. I think there's so much more to us than just like our finances. But we actually require every single client that works with us to have a financial or a wealth plan. Like, this is a foundational document that we're using that's basically your personal financial business plan in a sense, right? How can you even begin talking about investing if we don't understand the full scope of your life? We can't invest in a vacuum. So we start off with this wealth plan. which is basically a living, breathing document. It's fluid, we revisit it often, that has your short-term, mid-term, and your long-term goals, your why, right? Understanding how we're gonna use money as a tool. We also are looking at all of your assets and liabilities. All of us can actually do this exercise on a simple sheet of paper. You don't need an advisor to do it. List out everything that you own, right? Anything that's of value to you. It could be an investment account. It can be a bank account. It could be a collection that you inherited from your grandmother. It could be a piece of art that's important to your family, all of your assets, and then all of your liabilities, anything that you owe. And this is really important because what we've noticed with healthcare professionals in particular, we all get this lifestyle creep. You see, you know, Dr. Conti said some people don't want to go to their mailboxes, or people live in these houses or this or that. Half of it's fake. A lot of those people are not actually living on their own money. They're living on borrowed money. So having an understanding of your liabilities is really important for this wealth plan. And then with all of this information, we try to get a better understanding of, are you actually going to be able to fund each one of these respective goals, right? Which goal is the most important? Are you actually using your money for your purpose, for your why? And this goes back to wellness. Are you actually investing in the right type of vehicles that make the most sense to you, that have the lowest fee? Are you saving and investing enough? Are you doing it in a tax advantageous manner? And then are you protecting your family, right? So from estate planning, risk mitigation, insurance. So all of these things are part of this broader plan, but we are strong believers that if you don't have a foundational plan, it's never going to become a reality, right? We only what we manifest and we put out into the universe actually becomes reality. So having a disciplined approach to sticking to this plan. The only last thing I'll note about this plan is we also stress test it. So we run it through different market conditions. You know, will the market be up? Will the market be down? Is your portfolio going to be able to withstand that? What does that look like for your family? And we revisit this often every time there's a change in your life. So it might be that you're getting another job or somebody loses their job. You know, how does that impact your longer term saving and investing? This is just a really important part of this plan.
Yeah, I'd say it's statistically proven to have, if you have goals written down on paper, your likelihood of achieving them are much higher. And revisiting that plan throughout the year to see if you're on track, it's actually, for many people, a really rewarding experience. For a lot of people, retirement is obviously their biggest goal, right? Especially if you're early in life. And that's something you have, you know, many years to save for. And so kind of tracking your progress towards that over time for a lot of people gives them a sense of security, as it should. Maybe it's not retirement, maybe it's buying your first home, or it's funding your children's education. For me, it's, you know, funding 529 plans for my nephews and my niece. You know, I like to see how close am I to achieving that goal every year. And it allows me to target it. If I need to adjust what I'm putting in to the account every year, I do that. If I need to spend a little less on my dog and a little more in their 529s, I do that. But it helps you prioritize the things that are important to you. And it is a living, breathing document. You don't do it once and don't revisit it. It's like a medical checkup, right? You guys get a medical checkup once a year. You should at least do that for your finances.
We found that this plan is really helpful also for the people that are dealing with caring and prioritizing their goals, but caring for other family members. Like, you know, we took care of my husband's grandmother for 15 years and then his mother. And we are the ones responsible for so many other family members. There are 6 more people we're going to be responsible for taking care of. So how do you make sure that you're prioritizing and saving for your own future, you know, the retirement, whatever it may be, while still helping them, but focusing on you first? And this plan allows us to see, like, what are the % likelihood chance that I'm actually going to be able to accomplish all of these goals, and how should I think about achieving each one first?
Where do you find the majority of people in this journey and then this relationship that they forge? Where do you find them struggling the most? Like, and you give them this blueprint, where do you find that they're having the most difficulty?
From a healthcare professional standpoint, or just in general in the Black and brown community?
Well, maybe both. Like, where are people struggling?
So typically, from a healthcare professional standpoint, it's even getting all the items needed to do the plan. So I can remember one time I actually went, there was a surgeon and he was in the middle of a surgery actually for a newborn, and he needed to take his like lunch break. So somebody, you know, there was a different attending in the room. I met him. He was literally eating scarfing down this sandwich, and he's watching the monitor, and I'm gathering the information from him verbally because he just did not have the capacity to give me any information. He was like, well, I know I have an account here, I have an account here, I want to accomplish this, that. So it's really at the very beginning for healthcare professionals, it's like finding the time to like focus on yourself to get this plan done, right? because we can't execute or create this plan until we have all of the inputs. We're only good as the data we're putting in. For the general Black and brown community, it is executing the plan. We end up being accountability partners and less financial advisors and more, well, I think there's no separation in my opinion, but every financial advisor spends their time differently. 75% of what we do is coaching people on how to change their behaviors with money and actually following through with what they need to do. So oftentimes in the Black and brown community, because they've never had these conversations before, they're like, well, where do I even start? How do I even, follow through with this? How do I even get a will? So it's us then helping them to execute. And so we break the plan down and say, okay, this is a lot. You have 15 items we need to accomplish in the next couple of years. Let's just focus on these 3. And we're gonna help you with this one first, and then the second, and then the third, and then that's all for this year, right? So we try to focus and try to make it more digestible. But it's a partnership. We all have to be in it together, and we oftentimes will partner with your other advisors if you have them. If not, or you might have outgrown them, we help you find those. Accountants, estate planning attorneys. Oftentimes we spend a lot of time with recruiters, right, to help you figure out how you're gonna get that next position and get the higher comp for it. And it may be labor and law attorneys to help you execute said compensation. So we spend a lot of time with the other advisors in your life to make sure we can get that plan executed.
I'd say generally, I think most people, and this applies to the broader community, don't actually know how much they're spending. And a financial plan can be really eye-opening for a lot of people. And oftentimes it can be a bit of an uncomfortable experience to go through it, but it's really necessary. One of the things we do around spending is making sure that you're spending intentionally. Right, so Maya talked about setting those goals. So every dollar should have a purpose. Are you spending on the things that matter to your goals, or are you spending on things that don't matter? And sometimes it's really just a recalibration of spending it on the right things, or saving it for the right things. And so that can be a really rewarding experience just going through the financial planning process.
I can just say personally, that resonates with me, just going back in the interview spaces I've been in, just looking back now, wishing I had that kind of leverage to engage those conversations, because I can't speak for anyone else, but I often found myself just kind of almost relenting to that sentiment that, oh, you should just be happy to be here,
right,
that we're letting you have this job. And I was in my mind saying to myself, yeah, I do kind of feel that way, versus going in with that level of confidence to be like, I'm the commodity, and you need to appreciate that. But so I really like hearing that's part of your approach. Shifting to the investment part, taking that money and making more and growing wealth. What would you say is your investment philosophy, and what would you say would be things for us to kind of look at over this next, say, remaining part of this calendar year as it relates to investment?
Yeah, it's a good question. We at Merrill, Maya, myself, and Elise, we benefit from having a really robust investment platform. But at least for our team, I can say that we don't think about investing in a silo. So we wear a lot of different hats before we even talk about what we're going to invest your money in. The first is, we're wealth planners, right? We need to get that financial plan created. Once we know what your goals are, that can help us determine what's your risk tolerance, what's your time frame, and then from there we can think about how to invest your money. Every investment strategy is going to be individualized to the person and to their underlying goals. So let's give you an example, right? You have a 30-year-old executive or medical professional. He's got 3 main goals. First is he needs to buy a home in 5 years. Second is retirement, and third is he wants to pass on his estate to his family later in life. So the first goal, buying a home, is more near term, 5 years. We're not going to invest that in something that's highly risky, right? Because those funds are going to be needed in 5 years. So the investment solution we're going to create will probably be something more moderate for that type of goal. For retirement, assuming they have maybe 30 more years to work, we would invest that more aggressively because of the time horizon that they have and the fact that they need to grow those funds for retirement. The third goal, wanting to pass those funds on later in life, as you near retirement, we start to dial back your risk in your investment portfolio because we want to preserve your assets and then pass it on to your next generation. So I think that's kind of how I think about high level. Also, I'd say that we think about the market in terms of very long-term views. If you have time in the market, that is your best asset. Time is a great equalizer in the financial markets. So someone nearing retirement, of course, we would not be as aggressive, but for younger people, you do benefit from having time in the market. Great example, you may have remembered when COVID hit in 2020, March of 2020. I'd incidentally just joined the team in March of 2020 and the office shut down. We had a massive drop in the markets, right? Because the whole world was saying, we don't know what's gonna happen with this pandemic. Our society's ever gonna reopen? Nobody knew it was gonna happen. And so you saw a over 20% drop, I think, in global financial markets. That recovered in almost 5 to 6 weeks later. And so reacting emotionally to events in the market can be really detrimental. And one of our main roles as investment managers is also thinking about psychology and talking to you about not making those mistakes and talking to you about staying focused on your goals, taking a long-term approach to markets rather than reacting emotionally. And so I think that's a key tenet to how we think about investing is taking a long-term focus and not making emotional decisions with your portfolio, rather focusing on your goals. I don't know if you want to add anything.
You mentioned earlier that inherent desire, or sometimes just out of necessity, to factor others into our financial and our wealth planning. And I would imagine that all of us, just somewhere in our minds, feel the need and desire to want to do right by our folk, family, friends, our family, spouses, children. So what are some things that you'd recommend in terms of kind of planning along those lines for those other people in our circle?
Yeah, I'd say the first thing is that have a financial plan, like Maya said. Discuss that plan with your family. If your goal is to pass it on to others in your family or different generations, it's important they know and are educated on what's coming to them. For a lot of reasons, right? They should be prepared to receive it. They should be prepared to be good stewards of the money or whatever they're getting. And it seems that allow a seamless transition to them. So I think just having that plan and then educating people on what's in it is very important. I've got a good example actually on this. Maya and I have a client who's the owner of a large private physician practice in the North Hills. Very, very busy, as you can imagine, works very long hours. When we first brought him on as a client, he had an existing estate plan, a will, trust, et cetera, done. When we went through the trust with him, it's something he hadn't looked at in, I think, maybe 15, 20 years. We went through the trust with him. He was giving the money to a beneficiary that he was no longer in contact with. And if he was to pass, his money would have gone to that person. So it's just something as small as looking at that. So we went through it. He also had a trustee that he also was no longer in contact with. So it was a big mess. And so sitting down with him and a state attorney, creating the documents, understanding what his wishes were, and making sure that the assets would pass in a way that he wanted to was really, really critical. And fortunately, we saw that, but there's probably millions of people out there that have documents that are outdated, that they haven't looked at, or they have no documents at all, which is another problem because then your assets get tied up at the state level, and it can take a long time for them to go where you want. So I think just making sure you have those basic documents in place, discuss it with an advisor, making sure you're comfortable with what's in it, that's all part of the plan of estate planning.
How many of you, I just want to ask a question, how many of you actually know what basic estate planning documents you should have and or have basic estate planning documents? Okay, this is good for us to talk about then really quickly. So we recommend that every individual that's an adult, or if you're a minor, because we do have some of these that are high earners, right? We work with a number of people in the entertainment space and also athletes. Anyone that's over 18 should have a will, right? And a will basically dictates out legally what will happen should something happen to you with those assets that we talked about in that financial plan. Because sometimes people don't even know what assets they actually have or they've never put it on paper, right? So everyone should have a will. Then everyone should also have advanced healthcare directive. And surprisingly, this is the number one thing that we see that health professionals do not have, which is a shocker. So you're probably all familiar with this document because it says what will happen to you if you become incapacitated, what will happen to your body, if you want to donate your organs, things like that. Who can make decisions on your behalf if something happens to you? And again, I would say 2/3 of the medical professionals we meet do not have that document, right? So that's the second thing. And then the third most basic estate planning document we think you should have is a power of attorney. And so there's a power of attorney that can be for healthcare or for financial. So somebody who can pay your bills should something happen to you, can sign on your behalf. You can make this go into effect if you become incapacitated, or right now, if you're really busy, you leave the country a lot and you want your spouse or a trusted family member or a friend to be your power of attorney from a financial perspective. So those 3 basic documents you should have in place. Now, where do you actually go for those documents? You can go to an estate planning attorney, but the easiest, most simple place you can go, and we talk to our clients about this all the time, and I know many of the systems here have this, during open enrollment, there is something called group legal services. And read the description, but group legal services will often say they have they provide estate planning support. During open enrollment, you sign up for that, you may pay $20, $30 a paycheck or a month, and you utilize the attorneys on that team to draft these documents for you. And then when open enrollment's over, or if you have a life event, right, you can also change your benefits, then you cancel it once you get those documents in place. Then every couple of years, maybe 3 to 5 years, you update those documents, because in that will, it'll also say if you have minor children, who's going to be the guardian of your children. And oftentimes, that is the number one thing that will change for some people, because things happen, and they don't have that updated. The other time to update your estate planning documents would be if you're moving to a different state, because each state has different laws, and we have seen this very often with physicians that are going to different systems, where they're going somewhere else to become the administrator of, I don't know, the Cleveland Clinic, for example, and they haven't refreshed their documents. Also very important if you're in a same-sex couple, because each state is different from a legal standpoint. So I just didn't want us to kind of gloss over that. I think it's important for everyone to have these basic estate planning documents. The other place you can go, there's a number of online services. I'm not going to say the name of any of them because I don't endorse or advertise any of them, and we're not attorneys. But there are also virtual services. Just make sure that when you get these documents, and if you're using a virtual tool, make sure you get them notarized in the state in which you live, because I think it's really important to have those documents. And then there's more complex estate planning documents we won't get into today that are used for different purposes to pass on wealth to protect your assets.
Awesome. I think this would be a great opportunity if there's anyone that has questions. Because I saw some people who look like they had questions.
Oh.
So I'm gonna.
Thank you. That information is so helpful. I've got kind of 2 questions. So one question is about passive income. Everyone tells me that I really shouldn't be reliant on the man to pay me. So can you talk about ways of developing passive income streams? And then the second question is protection of our assets, because a lot of us are medical professionals. We can get sued theoretically. We're underneath malpractice insurance, but how do we protect ourselves liability-wise in terms of our assets?
Yeah, so passive income is a good one. Look, that's a broad term. So typically, when people say passive income, they're referring to income streams coming from either businesses or assets, or it could be investment assets, it could be rental homes, it could be anything that's paying you income where you're not actively doing work. That being said, passive income, and we're not CPAs, is still income. And so whatever you're getting there, you need to factor into your overall wealth plan and obviously your tax projections. Passive income can also come from your portfolio in some ways, right? If you're invested in certain instruments that pay dividends or interest, that is technically passive income, right? And so there's a lot of different ways to think about it. Whatever you're gonna do in that sense, you'd wanna make sure it's incorporated in your financial plan. Understand what's the risk of this passive income turns off, right? Because just because it's passive doesn't mean it's risk-free. If it's in a real estate property, there's inherent risk there. If it's in the market, there's inherent risk there. So thinking about that is important. But yeah, I think that term's used a lot. We see a lot of people that want a higher share of passive income for good reason. It's just important to include in your overall financial plan.
Also, one of the things that we've spent a lot of time with physicians, administrators talking about is not only passive income, but other income streams in general. And I'll give you a quick example. We helped a physician, a pretty well-known physician, not in Pittsburgh, but in another market, connect with an opportunity to be like the public figure of a new private company that was coming out that needed a healthcare professional. And so, this person does appearances maybe 5 times a year and gets a pretty sizable paycheck. So I think there's lots of other ways you can think about generating income. Further on in one's career, you can also look at potential board seats. We've also helped identify maybe consultancy roles for clients. So I think one of the most important things that we try to do is not only educate people and help them obviously with their investments and their assets, but is making sure that they have the right network. Because imagine if we're working with some of the wealthiest families in the country that all may have come from the same place. We specialize in working with a lot of people that are set in wealth, so that are newer to the wealth conversation. We try to get them connected so that they can continue to amplify one another and find business opportunities, right? And so I think when we think about passive income can look a lot of ways, and I think we have to kind of get out of the box and look at how everybody else has kind of had been doing it before us, Joe. Did you want to talk about the disability insurance example, maybe? Because she asked about insurance.
Oh, and on the disability insurance, so this is a big one for medical professionals.
Or insurance, like risk mitigation.
Risk
Asset
mitigation.
protection.
Okay. So insurance just generally?
Asset protection.
Asset protection, okay. So again, that's a bit of a broad term. So we think about insurance as our main tool for mitigating risk. Insurance protects more tangible assets, right? So you would get like property insurance, you'd have insurance for medical malpractice, you'd have insurance to protect your car, et cetera. Having those policies in place to make sure your assets are protected are important. There's also insurance, obviously, for liability. When we think about protection of investment assets, that comes into when we create your wealth plan. What is your risk tolerance? So understanding what's your time frame, what's your risk tolerance will allow us then to build a portfolio that has the right level of value-adjusted risk in it based off our conversations. So that's sort of how I would think about it high level. I don't know if you want to...
Yeah, but from like more of an estate planning perspective, asset protection. So sometimes what we'll encourage clients to do is, for example, if your home is your biggest asset, we might have them put in some kind of like land trust or an LLC, right? So that it deflects the opportunity if somebody, a creditor or a patient or anyone else tries to sue you. Also, we spend a lot of time looking at umbrella policies, umbrella insurance, so that it matches or mirrors how much you may have in terms of your full balance sheet. So, you know, if you're worth $3 million, then we might encourage you to get an umbrella policy or liability coverage that's higher than that. So if somebody tries to sue you again, they wouldn't touch your assets, they would first go to that policy. So it really depends on the client. Some clients are more comfortable shifting, and again, this is really dependent on your situation, shifting your assets to be in the name of your spouse, right? Or being in different trust vehicles that are irrevocable that you do not have control over. So there's lots of different techniques. We also will do a lot of prenuptial planning for clients that have adult children that are going to get married and they have very sizable balance sheets and they want to make sure that they're protecting their child from the future child's spouse. So there's lots of different things, but that is one of the conversations that occurs, especially during that wealth plan, to make sure we're thinking about risk mitigation kind of in every area.
The one thing I would add is insurance in itself can be a very, very complex product. And I know particularly a lot of medical professionals will approach early on in their careers around insurance. I would encourage you before you make any type of decision around that to talk to some sort of financial planner to make sure you understand what you're purchasing and why. Because it can be very, very complex, even for people that have been in the industry for a long time.
Yeah, so we tend to see people get sold disability policies and whole life policies before, when they're even residents or fellows early on, and then it ends up being their whole paycheck going to pay these policies, which is a problem. But there's a lot of predatory behavior in the Black and brown communities in general, not even healthcare professionals, where we see this happening.
As we would say in the church, amen lights.
Yeah.
Having learned that the hard way. And so a lot of what I hear you saying is so similar to the relationships we strive to forge with our patients, because you are doing deep dives into very personal things, and it requires a level of implicit trust. And so, I get you, and Shiv just mentioned, you've got to find that right person that is best for you. And so I hope that people are listening. What I'm gathering from what you're saying is that first decision is an important one, because that relationship is what's going to drive everything. I did have a question that came to mind when you mentioned stewardship, and particularly with children. And Dr. Johnson mentioned, from a professional standpoint, sometimes we're the first of something. We're the first in our department, et cetera. Well, many of us are also the first wealth earners. And so what, do you have any resources at your disposal that you can deploy to help parents help their children as they navigate, even say high school? You know, more than just, you know, PNC says you should get start a checking account for your child. Like, how do you have resources to help us help our kids develop
Yeah.
some financial stewardship?
Yeah, we actually do a lot of programming around this because we find that oftentimes the children actually know more than the parents, right? The high school students. You'd be surprised. Again, TikTok, it is a huge opportunity. So what we like to do is make sure the parents are armed with understanding how to educate their child at each point of their journey. I actually have a few financial education workbooks that I'll leave that shows, okay, if your child, you know, is up to 5 years old, this is how you should talk about money, up to 9, up to 15, and whatnot. But we spend a lot of time either bringing parents and children together and having conversations and kind of meeting them where they are. We've done a lot of programming like that. But we found the most important thing is the behavior that you're modeling, right? Because your children are always watching, and it doesn't have to be when you're just talking about money, but it's how you're talking about money, right? Are you bringing them with you to deposit, you know, cash at the bank? And I know we don't really even go to financial centers anymore, but I purposely bring my daughter to financial center just so she can understand what a branch looks like, how the mechanics of the bank works, having your child actually pay for something on their own at a grocery store. Like, all of these little things you can do in your daily life are so important, but it's not shying away from the conversation and making sure we're always talking about money as a tool, as a form of empowerment to move us forward and not as something negative, because that's what we've seen to tend to happen in the Black and brown communities. I'll leave those financial education workbooks for you, and then you can also share them with the people that are virtual.
Awesome. And
It's a link to the Merrill site.
And as you may or may not know, we have a Journey to Medicine pipeline program, and I could envision that being a major part of the programming and teaching that financial stewardship piece to these young learners who start their journey to medicine in 5th grade right now. So we'll definitely have to reach out about that. In the last few minutes, yes.
I can use my bigger voice.
Why?
Save some steps. Okay. Oh, got it. So I've been working with a financial advisor for some years, out of in-kind, the spirit of in-kind, donation of time and services. But I'm finding that with my modest income and just the difference in how we were raised and our lifestyle, that we're starting to be a bit of a mismatch. And even listening to you speak about some of the things that should be in place after several years are not in place, what is your recommendation for someone with a more modest income and maybe shifting that relationship elsewhere?
So very often in life, we outgrow our relationships. Whether you outgrow your mentor, you outgrow your sponsor, you may outgrow your advisors, right? This happens to all of us. Sometimes we even outgrow our employer. I think that it's important for you to understand where your values are, and make sure that anybody who's involved in your life, especially when you're talking about something as intimate as money or even healthcare, that they have your best interests at heart. You understand how they're compensated, you know, how they're going to give advice, and making sure it's a match with your own, which it sounds like you're already starting to do. And then arm yourself with questions around what you think you should be asking for that next provider. You know, I really like to ask, what types of clients are you working with that are similar to me? How are we going to spend our time together? How much time am I actually going to hear from you versus someone else on your team, right? Are you going to help me with my full financial plan, or are you just only going to help me with my investments? Because I think, unfortunately, in our industry, Shiv, myself, at least we all know this, we're very product driven. This is one of the reasons why we chose to move our team and our practice to Merrill, is because we don't have our own proprietary products. So oftentimes, the advisors that we're working with, they may be trying to encourage us to invest in a certain thing or buy a certain thing because that's how they're compensated. So you want their values to align with yours, their intent to align with yours. And I think there is a lot of opportunity, like I talked about before, around, it doesn't matter, you know, how you're starting out or how much you have, because again, wealth is relative. It's all about finding the match from a value standpoint. And then I think if it's the right person, they'll work with you regardless of how much you're making. And just what you're making now, it's not going to be what you're going to make in the future. We've seen this. Some of the people that we've spent a lot of time helping are some of our largest clients now. Because it's a journey. Wealth is a journey, right? And how you get there. So I hope that answered your question. Just one other thing related to that. If you don't have a financial advisor and you have a retirement plan at work, the retirement plan providers are required by law to give you education about your investments and help you with financial plan. So hold them to it, lean in. Your organizations are already paying for that. They're paying a fee to have those providers there. So that can also be a starting point for people that don't have one.
I think with the final few minutes that we have, you've walked us through all of these important steps. But as you know, in this delayed gratification space of healthcare, there are different stages in this journey. So if you could just summarize kind of the key points as it relates to the key stages in the journey, say, for example, medical school, residency, just finishing, and maybe mid or late in your career, if you could hit on just a few key points, emphasis, what would they be?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the first thing you should do as early in your career as possible is create that plan, or at least a budget, because then you have something you can try to stick to. That obviously will evolve as you progress throughout your career. One of the things that's unique to medical professionals, oftentimes they're going to grad school, and so with that comes a large burden of student loans for many people. And so this oftentimes seems like an insurmountable amount of debt. But Maya and I like to think of debt as there's good debt and there's bad debt, right? So good debt is something like investing in yourself to get an advanced degree, right? Because the ROI on that over your lifetime can be very, very high, well, way in excess of what you're paying for the loan. But figuring out how to pay down that loan throughout your career does require a little bit of work. And so having a financial plan or a budget can help you think about, how do I direct some of my cash flow as my income starts to go up towards paying down this loan? Oftentimes that loan might be the highest interest rate you have in terms of debt. It may not be. Maybe you have some credit card debt as well. And there's approaches that any advisor, or you can even look up online, can help you think about how to pay down that highest cost debt first. So that's one thing I would recommend for early stage careers. Have a plan, have a budget, and a plan to tackle the debt if you have it. The other thing I would say is your income goes up pretty quickly after you leave medical school. This can lead to lifestyle creep for many people. Be wary of that. Overspending just because your income went up can be really detrimental.
Can you post that on the site somewhere?
So bad.
Yeah, but it's not specific to medical professionals, right? Lifestyle creep happens to a lot of people. Maya and I work with athletes, right? Getting that first big contract can lead to a lot of large lifestyle changes, particularly for someone that maybe didn't have substantial assets before that. So part of our work as financial advisors is being a behavioral coach, thinking about how to think about that change in your life now that you have this money, what to do and what not to do, being intentional with your funds. That should apply to all of us. So be very wary of lifestyle creep. And then I think the third thing I'd say is just be intentional about saving and investing for the future. Take a long-term approach. Don't think about where you want to be tomorrow or next week, or that car you want to buy in a month. Think about where you want to be in 20, 30, 40 years. And I think that helps you be a little more intentional with your funds.
I had two specific questions. One is about newly just out of residency, or they're almost out of residency. They're now looking for jobs, and people are throwing money at them. And typically it's in the form of a sign-on bonus, that big bolus of money that usually exceeds probably what your first year, your yearly salary as a resident. From a strategy standpoint, would it be more strategically advantageous to try to parlay that into, say, a loan repayment versus a bolus of money? Are those things that you could help a senior resident who's coming out of residency, who's facing people who are now trying to woo them and help them work through? Because without it, just speaking for me, you see the zeros on what they're offering, and you've forgotten about your debt, because now you're saying, ooh, okay, I can use this for this now, versus, so that's the
Yeah.
first question. Then the second, and then I'll let more people ask, is it ever really too late to make changes in your wealth management plan? Like, can someone, say, who's 50, 60, say to themselves, it's just too late for me to even bother trying to find a financial advisor?
Maybe I'll take the first one when Maya take the second part. It really depends on the person. So part of the value of having a financial plan is you have assets and liabilities. And so that student debt's going to be there on the liability page. So we don't want you to forget about it because it is part of your financial plan. So thinking about how to pay down the debt, it varies. It depends on the interest rate, depend on your income streams, what other debt do you have. We run a lot of different scenarios to figure out what's the most efficient way to pay it down. So it's really going to depend on each individual person.
So we actually just went through this exercise with someone earlier in the year who was being offered fellowships, and this can happen at any point of your career journey. And he and his wife were talking to me, and he was like, yeah, we could go to Seattle, we could go to Boston, LA, and they're in Chicago, or we could go to Columbus. And I was like, okay, show me all of the offers, right? And we actually laid it out and created a matrix. And I think it was very interesting for them to see. We're going to look at the cost of living. We're going to look at all of these other things you potentially want to ask for, and you're going to go back and negotiate part of the student loan repayment. We're going to negotiate corporate housing or some kind of, temporary housing for your full family unit at each one of these places that have the highest costs, right? You're going to ask for all these additional things. Oh, and by the way, all these offers, the signing bonus, we're going to be cutting those in half because you're going to have to pay taxes on it. And then which one actually looks most appealing now that you're going to have to make twice as much in LA and deal with the commute and work 3 times the amount of hours and really be isolated versus in Boston where you may be able to spend less, they're paying you more, the cost of living isn't quite the same. So I think there's so many other factors that objective parties, and it doesn't have to be a financial advisor, can help you if you step away, look at everything in totality, and then kind of see how it shakes out for your family unit. So I think it's more than just looking at that sign-on bonus in summer, because that's super dangerous, as we know. Then in terms of an advisor, and having a plan, like you can start at any point, right? There was one college president that we met with, and a college president had never saved in his 403B. He thought it was automatic, okay? So you can always start. There's always room and opportunity to come back, because the worst thing you can do is leave it for everyone else in your family if something happens to you, if you become incapacitated or whatever, to try to figure out on their own. Like, you really owe it to yourself and all of the work and education you've put in to plan, but you can plan at any time. You just need to start somewhere and have the right team that's going to support you.
Are there any other questions? And again, this is a marathon, not a sprint. Our hope is to have these kinds of conversations throughout and come up with different vehicles to communicate the information because we have auditory, visual, and tactile learners. And so again, thank you guys so much for being here, and I hope you all took something away from this that will help you moving forward. I'm going to turn this back over to Dr. Johnson. I know we have one more session, which will be a working lunch session, and we invite our guests, if you wish to stay, and we'll be talking about just kind of what the next steps are in our space where we live and work and do our thing. So thank you.
Thank you.
very much.
Well, I won't be long. This was a very powerful morning, and I want to thank all of the presenters for their expertise and insights. When I stood up here this morning, I asked you all to write down something that you wanted to get out of this morning's session. So I'll share with you what I wrote. I wanted to write down and capture key phrases and key thoughts, which would help me going forward. So I'm going to be transparent. I'm going to share what I wrote down. Just some key phrases that were said this morning. They're not in any order. Drop your bucket where you are. That resonated with me. Stay in our lane as providers. That resonated with me because we often get pulled in so many directions. Refresh and restore. I need to do that more often. Young people, my kids always say this, establish boundaries. I'm going to try to do that better. Have a personal support system. Know your why about your wealth. And wealth is relative, and wealth is a journey. We can change our behavior with money. This was said many times. The importance of executing on the plan. Only what we manifest and put into the universe becomes your reality. I thought that was powerful. Prioritize what's important to you. Don't make emotional decisions, but focus on your goals. Get your documents in place and up to date and in order. Make sure your financial advisor aligns with your values, but that can go for anything. Make sure who you're working with, who your friends are, who everything aligns with your values, because if it doesn't, it's just going to create conflict for you. That includes your job. That can include your current job. Being intentional about saving and investing in long term. I can tell you, young professionals, this journey goes by real fast. You look back and it's over, or it's in the next chapter, the next act, the next phase. So be intentional about savings. Even if you think you don't have a lot of money right now, save. And you can always start. So whatever you're doing, we can always start over. Start somewhere and have the right team around you. So those are some of my key takeaways from this morning, and they were said by a lot of different people in this room. So thank you, whoever was the author of these statements, because you were excellent. Dr. Tony?
Dr. Johnson, would you care to write that out and email it to everyone?
Sure, I will. I will put that. I'll put that in the Gateway chat, and I'll give it to Tamara so she can send it out to everybody who's registered. Okay, and you may have your own, so you might have some too. All right, and with that, we will go into the next session, which is lunch. And then we'll be back for our next panel discussion. Thank you all very much.
Dr. Saladin, thank you so much. So we're gonna get started on our panel discussion for over lunch today. I'm Dr. Rachel Toney, Vice President of the Gateway Medical Society, so I'll be moderating this session, which we hope will be like looking at a podcast. And so we can kind of discuss in summary of what we've talked about and the issues that we've had today in terms of our equity matters. And so this panel discussion is now what? From organization to action, and from action to outcomes. We're going to have Drs. McAllis Hogan, orthopedic surgeon, and Dr. Anita Edwards, the treasurer of Gateway Medical Society and medical director of Highmark Whole Care, to guide this panel. So my first question for the panelists are, what are your personal experiences of being a healthcare professional of color?
Am I allowed to defer?
Yes.
No, Dr. Evans.
I know that was your first question, but as we've been sitting here today with this conversation, and I am originally from Pittsburgh, this is my home. And I think about the change that medicine has gone through in the city of Pittsburgh. I don't know, most of you are probably younger, maybe one of two of us remember. But I remember when you used to have that family doctor who used to be in your neighborhood. I don't know if there was a Dr. Greenleaf, there was a Dr. Stewart, there was a couple of them who was around. And I think we were able to see black doctors. You knew what a black doctor looked like. You knew that they were black doctors. It wasn't a foreign thought. But I think now we have lost that. As he was talking about the pipeline and the leak and us being mentored, but our children don't see us. They don't, there's nowhere for us to be visible to young people unless we physically go out and do something. But they're not gonna see you on the street. They don't know you in your grocery stores. They don't go to church. As we was just talking, somebody has a Sunday meeting, so she won't be at church tomorrow because her doctor's called a Sunday meeting. So this revolution of medicine, what I used to think of medicine, this holistic thing, this family thing, this thing where, you know, you could wrap yourself around a doctor, and he was not just the physician that was going to take care of your physical body, but he was the pillar of the community. I don't think that's what we have anymore. I think it has left being a career and our purpose, and almost just becoming a job. And I think that's the sadness about it, is that medicine is now a job and somebody's running our business and we no longer run our business.
You make some very good points, because a lot of what we see for ourselves, we are exposed to in someone that looks like us. That very powerful image of that little boy touching Barack Obama's hair. So if you don't see it, you can't aspire to it. But I wonder, Dr. Hogan, what are your thoughts on how have we gotten away from being in charge of our businesses, and maybe how is there a way that we can reclaim some of that power back?
No, I think, outstanding question, and the point that was made of the impact of the community physician and of the physician in general. And I think it does impact the presence that physicians have in general, but particularly physicians of color. And so I say this often, and a couple of one of my faculty members is here, Dr. Amanda McCoy, for Peds Ortho at Children's, and she's from Pittsburgh, right? And I grew up in Alabama, so I used to always say to people, I'm a Pittsburgh immigrant, right? And the gentleman who recruited me here, Freddie Fu, would say that too. He said, look, you are politically and emotionally neutral to this place, and that likely could be very good for you, right? And trying to evolve beyond, and at the time, respectfully, and this, us sitting next to each other proves it, it was actually in respect to the Highmark UPMC wars. He said, when I came in this place in 2012, 2013, there were several people who were here, that was at the height of the conflict. That's right. And I was getting it from both sides, from people saying, you should come, you should not come, that place is going nuts, we have no idea what's gonna happen there. I mean, someone called me when I was a fellow, while I had already signed my contract, and said, we don't think you should come to Pittsburgh anymore. That person did not look like me, and they are no longer here anymore. And they probably would be working for me. I know they would if they were still here. So their intent of that phone call, now I will tie that into their intent of that phone call as being a physician of color. I think this person thought my integrity was gonna allow me to be okay with backing out of a contract and a commitment that I had signed just because I was not from here, and because he obviously did not know how the blood runs through my veins. I'm loyal, right? But he also did not know, he probably thought he was just calling this young guy who he's heard about, who happens to be black, who just, okay, he'll probably believe me and run scared. Right? And so I take that as an example to say, what I decided at that point, I remember saying to Dr. Fu, and even to my wife at that time, who was in Philly finishing her residency, I said, we're gonna go to Pittsburgh, we've already committed. To this point in time today, right, we must fight the urge to retreat from those different forces that you were speaking of, which are very true. Okay, when I look back, when you made the comments about, where the physicians are, particularly physicians of color, black physicians in our community, are they seeing us in our churches, in our community events? Are they seeing us at activities? Are they seeing us outside of, respectfully right now, for someone to see me in the office, they have to have an orthopedic injury. Think about the percentage of how often that happens. So I'm actually asking a kid to go break their ankle to come figure out a way to see me, just to say, are you real? Right? Otherwise, it's like so many forces, whether it's the business forces, whether it is well-intended, blocking them from getting to me in some way. So we have to find a way to get ourselves out there. And in forums such as this, but also in the broader forums within the community, those that are healthcare related and that are not, because I believe that is our next phase, as your career has shown as well. You have to balance it, and particularly in this world now, you have to balance being out there and being busy, but also being out there and being effective. And I think it is that much more important for our community and for physicians of color. Because I remember the first doctor I knew in my hometown in Alabama was a family practice doctor who was a black guy who was known for two things. One, being a black physician in North Alabama, and he also played football for Bear Bryant. Right? I mean, that's how we knew who this guy was. And you never saw him at church a lot. You knew he was always busy. He was taking care of essentially every family, but you knew who this guy was. So every student from my hometown, particularly whether you were of color or not, wanted to find a way to get to this guy's office, right? To just experience time with him. And that's when he's also the same person who knew the orthopedic surgeon who fixed my ankle when I was 17, who told me I should do orthopedic surgery. He knew Dr. Stanley. He said, I know your father. I know your family. You should think about doing orthopedic surgery. I love my job. And that was it, right? So we need to fight the urge to retreat. So thank you for your question.
Yeah, I really like those themes that are coming up, because what you speak of is pipeline.
Right.
And what you speak of is advocacy. And also what you speak of is networking. And so none of us are going to be able to, as an individual, fight the tide of how our vocations have been turned into jobs because of a business model. But back to your point of being politically neutral, another idea comes up, which is that you have one healthcare system, you have another healthcare system, but then the third healthcare system is the healthcare that we deliver to our communities.
Right.
And so, a concept comes up, which is how can we intentionally serve that third healthcare model, that third healthcare system?
Well, that's odd,
Yeah.
Rachel, because you and I just kind of did it earlier this morning. While we were sitting here, I went and did a little small talk for a group of women who wanted to hear about heart disease. There's other ways for us to extend ourselves. And Rachel, Dr. Tony, she just came on in, sat down, and started talking to them about GI. But they loved it, and they was like, "Well, how now do we find her? We want her number." Because people are looking for people who will interact and be in personal. When our young people don't see us, they don't know what to expect. They do what they see. And these women now are looking for a black GI doctor. And so we have to figure out how to put ourselves, we have to intentionally, because you're right. I mean, after the end of the day, you're tired, your nerves are racked, your family now wants you if you got family. And you have to say intentionally, I'm going to do something else with my life other than that 8 hours of seeing a patient every 10 minutes and trying to write a note and answer a call and sign a piece of paper. And I'm going to do something that will actually validify what I am, who I am. You have to do that for yourself. Otherwise, I think you'll lose yourself. I think you probably know, and we know they say physicians are the first one for suicide, drinking. But I think that's because we don't know what our purpose is. I think we lose that purpose. There was a drive that made us want to be a physician. I know Dr. Conte said, we, what did he said? It was elite, I think he said. But I see it as a gift. This is a gift from God, and we have to take it and use it, or we'll lose it.
That's a powerful statement. And I think it also ties into hobbies. Being accessible to our community could be classified as a hobby, because it's not something that is a commodity, but it is valuable and it serves ourselves.
But it is a commodity, because if I can meet one young person and convince them that medicine is the way, and, or, you know, that they can make it, that they can get out of whatever situation they are in, as Dr. Johnson was saying earlier, many of us are our first. We are the first. So somebody inspired us to make that step and say, you can do this. And if we can do that, that's a commodity, because this is what we're talking about. We are now reinventing ourselves. You know, we're developing our legacy. Our concern is we're going to get old and there's nobody to take care of us. So if we can develop that legacy, then we are a commodity. And we're the only ones that can do that.
It's a true statement. True statement.
You know, on that note, I mean, a couple of things when we talk about pipeline and the community seeing what we're doing and building a critical mass, right? And my and my man, Dr. McCoy, probably laugh about this, because my wife and I, since we were both physicians, we both trained at Howard, and we actually bring in medical students we mentor now, or who will call us, or my residents, you know, black, white, or indifferent. It's a generational shift in the need of connectivity and connection. And so she and I will talk about it. If it's a Saturday and we get a phone call, or when I was the program director, a resident would text or call. She was like, man, like she thought about, did I ever call the program director on a Saturday about something that was not clinical? Like, you know, or just text this person. And a number of us are shaking our head like no, I call, like never, like, you know, and more importantly, now maybe it's, and more importantly, did they respond, even if I did, right, you know, and so, and we talk about that, and we joke about it, right, but at the same time too, it will be, you're right, we're some of the only individuals who can do some of those things. I mean, I walked around a mall once with my kids with one of my residents, because I was just like, you know what, you sound like you need to talk to somebody. So you know what, I'm going to Ross Park Mall, so if you want to talk in person, because my kids are not going to let me talk to you while we're in the car because they are loud as hell, right? So if you really want to talk, and you know the kids already, because I would take my girls, you know, before COVID, I would take them into to M&M, and they would yell in the back of the room, like, Daddy, it's a hand on the screen. Like, they would see the x-ray, and I'd be like, shh, you know, you can't talk. But, you know, Dr. Fu was a family person, so he supported that, but they could see. So when I said one of my residents is coming to walk around the mall with me, who they had never met, it was no problem, right? It goes to that point of like, they were like, oh, okay, this is just what you do, which is different, and that evolves. And if we actually don't contribute to that pipeline of conversation and the people around us to appreciate that, no one else will. It's not to say no one else will, but that is actually not the relationship building.
Right.
Is not one of the core. It is implicit in this concept of patient experience and of workplace wellness, and it's implicit. But again, it's hidden in the shadows. And the only things that actually come out of the closet that are in the dark are the things you open the door on and actually do yourself. You got to pull the lever on your own, right, to build relationships and to say, you know what, I'm willing to be here for you, or connect you with someone who can be when I cannot, and that's building the team. Right, so I just got on the phone with one of my residents in the lab, who is basically, he and several other of my residents, Dr. McCoy knows how I do that, they have vetted every single student from undergrad or in medical schools who want to come work with us for the next 6 months or a year already. They like interview like multiple, and I talk to all of them, I review them, because they understand we know what we're trying to build here, but I also recognize, I said a couple of years ago, I said, you know what, there's no way I can talk to all these students. Right. And I don't want to tell them no. I don't want to ignore their email, even though a few have probably slid by. So how can we do the best that we can? And that's building the team. That's building the network, and then trying to just permeate that out in some way. So, but you need each individual to do their best that they can when they can, right? So sometimes we can connect with 10 people. Sometimes I can only connect with one. And other times I say, you know what, I'll talk to the rest of you guys next week. Or you know what, if you can't wait, talk to this person who I know you trust, I trust them, and we circle back, right? And I think that's very important to be able to build out. But you need a pipeline to build out. You can't build out within yourself. That's when you actually burn out, right? That's when you truly are like, all right, I just can't take any more phone calls.
You may only be able to reach one.
Yeah, reach one.
But you hope it's a pyramid, right, and that then it spreads.
You want that ripple effect.
You may only
Now,
reach one.
something that comes up is you make very good points about being accessible and meeting people where they are and allowing them into the free moments in your life. What would you say would be an approach for someone who is an introvert, someone who
Yeah.
is shy, someone who's quiet, someone who is not used to breaking bones for a living.
There are a lot of introverts who like breaking bones. Some people come. No, I'm just joking. No, I have no. But look, I have no doubt, and I know for a fact there are people in this room who have emailed me or texted me, and I haven't responded to them yet. But they know when I see them, it's like, hey, how can I help you? What I say with the I ask people, what are you passionate about? I actually enjoyed that question, and people often don't get it. And look, I'm living in a little bit of a utopia, right? The environment will never break my optimism. And that's from the grace of God. That's not from the world. That's from the grace of God, family. I say, may have some bad moments, but I'm going to do my best. That optimism, I truly believe, is infectious. And so what I try to say to people when, okay, you're not as outgoing, what are you passionate about? What do you enjoy doing? What do you actually enjoy being involved in? And I like doing that as an inventory on people too. So when somebody else says, oh, I actually like this. Oh, really? I had no idea you like badminton, but I know somebody else who does, this person over here. And they're like, really? So I like doing connectivity like that. The other thing I like saying to people is like, hey, there's nothing wrong with telling people what you enjoy or just passing through some things, even if you don't enjoy it, just to kind of assess the environment. That's the part that we sometimes avoid. I tell students regularly, do not put yourself on your own island. Everybody thinks this is like, I'm to myself, I'm doing my thing. That only works when you're a billionaire. And even then, they just buy the island so they can go when they want to, not because they want to be there all the time. So you have to be careful with that. Like when you say, okay, and the environment though, how do we get individuals? And I actually look for the people in the corner of the room who's like, okay, has anybody talked to so-and-so in a while? But I'm odd like that. Like I'm that type of person and I know most leaders, most people, it's like being in New York City when I was a fellow. They're just doing their own day. I mean, they're not trying to figure out what anyone else is doing. So, and I know it's not simple. It is actually hard to do, to come outside your shell, or for people to even welcome you outside of that when the environment is very volatile. And so that's
the point that I wanted to get to.
Yeah.
Because maybe not every physician of color in training has the benefit of a attending or a faculty member or a program director that wants to build connectivity. Let's say someone finds himself in a program like that. What would be, just in anybody's opinion, ways that they can build that support network that was talked about earlier today?
And not blowing Gateway Medical Society's horn or the NMA, but I think we have forgotten what the NMA was started for. And we have been lulled into a sense that the AMA can do for us what the NMA can do. Now, I do think the AMA has a purpose, but they have now developed a whole section. I mean, if you go to the NMA meetings, you will see that there's a whole lot of us now sitting over in the AMA in the whole section, because now they think they can achieve the same thing, but we can't, because that's, we talked earlier, we have to be our own advocates. We can only advocate for ourselves, and we only can advocate for ourselves when we are in a large mass, in a large group. By myself, I am almost powerless, but in a group, I can do something. And so therefore, if a student is, or a resident is having trouble, and they come to me individually, there's not much I can do. But if you belong to an organization already, and we already know you, and you have affiliations, and you have relationships, we talk about this word relationship, and then you come, and now we can advocate for you, or we can go to the NMA and say, well, they're a member, or there's a member of the Student National Medical Body, but we don't belong to these things anymore, because we're talking about diversity and inclusion, and so we think because we now are included in other stuff that we don't need our own, and we still need our own.
You make a very powerful point, because of the fact that in training, in work, there are sometimes, I believe, situations we've all been in where we might be getting gaslit. And you always have to
I think outside of your efforts to bite your tongue so that you don't end up being written up or being singled out, is to maybe have a resource to say, was that appropriate?
Right.
But even more important is, do I have a right to feel the way I do? First of all, yes, you do have a right to feel the way you do. And so.
And what is my recourse?
Yes.
See, we don't know what our recourse
Okay,
is.
okay.
We have no idea that there is things that we can do, and we have to do it properly. And like you said, the next thing you know, we're sitting there with a correction action plan sitting in front of us and don't know what to do with it. Do I sign it and keep my job, or do I not sign it and they let me go? I don't know what to do with this. I don't know who to turn to. I don't have a mentor to say, well, this is now what you need to do. And those are the things that we should be able to help each other through. Older physicians should be able to help younger physicians. The organization should be able to help them through so that they don't get in trouble. We just talked about how much this costs. You 8 years of school and then somebody tells you you can't work anymore. What are you supposed to do? You know, because you've gotten into a correction plan. So we need to be mentoring all the way through. But as you said, sometimes it can't be that individual because you may be in a program where you're all by yourself. You may not never see anyone else but you for days. So you need to know that there's an organization you can reach out to and say, I need help.
Yeah, so the point about, so I went to 2 HBCUs, which a number of you know, right? I was at Xavier, then I was at Howard, and then I was at 2 majority institutions, right? I was at University of Virginia, and then special surgery, which is affiliated with Cornell. And I often talk about that balance because I've experienced those sides of, and I remember being at Howard when you had students who came in who did not go, who went to majority institutions before they got to Howard. And then you had a mix of us who went to HBCUs, right? And then, so then you go to your residency where all of us knew, I mean, it's only so many, you know, historically black or majority black hospitals or medical school, you know, training programs, you were potentially going to be one of the only ones. And I remember being at UVA where we had a number of minorities and women in our residency. The chairman was black, he was African American. And so we were, but I remember that spotlight too, when you would walk around campus and people say, you must be in orthopedics. You know, because they were like, and it almost inferred, you're proud of it initially, but then you realize, well, hold on, there are a lot of residencies here. So if they randomly picked me out in a white coat and said, you must be in orthopedics, they were like, because you're definitely not in any other department. Right? They knew. And so it goes to the point you said too, when you have that isolation and the reverse of that. And so how can you reach out? And it is very important for us to work outside of our own silos. And that's why, and not just for the individual who's dealing with those challenges, but for the people when, I mention this to my team regularly, our goal is to create opportunities so you can truly shine in whatever universe you want to shine in, so that people can actually see you and have whatever hope they can generate through seeing you. Not, okay, we've got this great little deal here because my chairman is, you know, black, we have tons of women, we have tons of minorities, so I'm just gonna keep this to myself, right? When you actually have that isolation throughout the hospital that occurs. And so that's very important to me. I have some introverts, you know, again, faculty from various backgrounds, but at the same time too, we need to be a positive reflection so that we hopefully can reach others, right? And at the same time, I speak with Dr. Chris Conti's wife, quite frankly, because we're the two, I mean, everybody knows it, we're the 2 black chairs at UPMC, right? And so having those conversations to where, do you understand your recourse? Do you understand what the process is? What is the process when you are having challenges? And there are opportunities on both sides. They are never, one side is always going to try to outshine or out-reflect the other, right? And to try to position their voice or their story, like you said, when you're getting gaslit, the person who has the gas in their hand is always going to win and say, no, we got to burn this grass. Like this grass is, I'm just culling. I mean, it's like growing up in farmland, right? You're like, why are you burning your own? Oh no, that grass, bad grass, Mac. I got to burn this grass is just going to help us be better in the long run. And you're like, well, if that's the case, then why are you burning it in secret? Like if it's supposed to be, you know, and why are you actually using illegal grass? Like, illegal gas. Like didn't they outlaw that gas? I mean, I started thinking about that, but also having a level of awareness, and that's what the NMA experiences. That's what you know, the experiences I've had in various groups. That's what Gateway brings to the table. The first group I intersected with when I got here was Gateway because of Barry Woods, who was from Pittsburgh, who was a chief resident and said, you need to go talk to the Gateway people, because he was leaving for fellowship like the next year, right? And so I met people. And so the value of that and that connectivity, those are the individuals who say, you know, right, it's a number of things I can mention to you now, and you say, yeah, I've seen this before. I've seen this play out. It sounds like the same thing that happened in 1986 or 1996. Or I mean, right? You know,
it's like being able to get a playbook
Yeah,
before you go into that
right.
institution.
Yes, it's nothing, and it's nothing wrong with getting a playbook.
No, absolutely not. Now, I wanted to, because we're getting close to the end here, I wanted to maybe ask both of you, because of the scrutiny that you both have been, and that I have been in my career and your careers, what would you say have been mechanisms for you to be able to survive under that weight? You know, how do you highlight your achievements when people are looking at you, but they conveniently don't see you when it's time to say you did well? And then finally, have any of you ever dealt with imposter syndrome? How do you cope with that?
I'll go first. I have no problem going first on this one too. So I'll go first. So the imposter syndrome, right? I look at imposter syndrome, and have I had those? It's one of those things. All of us who are med school, right? And these diagnoses that people say, this is an early one. We don't know if it's going to survive. This diagnosis may not exist in 15 to 20 years. So I actually think about when I was a medical student from 2002 to 2006. I never remember anybody mentioning imposter syndrome. I never remember people even saying the word resilience over and over and over again. I was also part of the era where pain was still the sixth vital sign. And I remember one of the godfathers of surgery and cancer management saying to us in a room, if you can't take care of your patient's pain, what type of doctor are you? Right? And I respected this man, so it was like, you know what? I guess I'm giving out more Percocet. I mean, I don't know what I'm doing. So I was just talking about the reflection, right? And
I'll
so
be over here with the Miralax.
yeah, exactly, right? And so as things evolve, and I think, you know, the weight of this is truly the community that helps, right? Family, for my faith, family, the extended family. I remember when I first, it's kind of funny. I knew Dr. Johnson. She didn't know I was going to call her out on this. But I knew Dr. Johnson, and I was working with the UPMC health plan. And it was actually inspiring to me when I was doing more work with the health plan on something completely unrelated, right? Around, you know, hip and knee bundle care. Every single medical director at the health plan, I mean this, probably everyone, who they would meet me, and they would say, oh, do you know Rhonda Johnson? Even though I was like, oh, Dr. Johnson, who's over at Highmark? They were like, yeah. Oh, she's great. You got to meet her. Now, I knew why the majority, you know, that when they were saying you have to meet her. They were like, okay, you know, guy doing insurance type work, black guy. We know this woman across town. I was like, oh, I do know Dr. Johnson. But it was inspiring that they were like, you have to meet this dynamic individual. She's a great friend, et cetera, from all different backgrounds. And that actually, ending with a point, that actually helps with the imposter syndrome. When you actually can see and know of other people who are like you, who are the imposter syndrome that you didn't even know existed, but you kind of take a little step back in the afternoon, like, okay, should I be doing this? Like, should I actually be in this position? Should I actually be on the front lines and in the press box when people are shooting at you? And you don't even know the people who are actually trying to undermine you. But you know they're out there. You know they're out there. And you're like, today was way too quiet. Why do I feel like I'm not being hunted today? Right? And then you see other people like, no, I got this. I mean, these are the type of things that do go through your mind. So again, again, faith, family, seeing others, the individuals in this room, or knowing of them, some who are not even here or who have been here, that really helps with that, even when you don't know that is what you are feeling, right? Until someone else tells you later, or until you read about it later. Like imposter syndrome, knew nothing about it in med school. I know a lot about it now, right? And then I also, as you guys can tell, I try to avoid the defeatist mindset. And then when I do feel that, I become comfortable with silence, right? I don't need to hyper-react. I don't need to go on the run. You know what? And that's where they say, I'm obviously spent a lot of time in the Baptist church in the South. That's why they say, peace be still.
That's right.
Every once in a while, you got to become comfortable with silence and peace be still, and know you are where you need to be in your journey, and then you go from there.
It's kind of like what they say, when someone is coding, check your own pulse.
You know, showing different in times. I think especially for me, people were just very blunt. If they didn't think you needed to be there, they just told you.
They didn't hide it.
Right, you didn't need to be there. There was no coding it or faking it or trying to make you feel like you fit in. They let you know that, you know, they weren't for you. And I'm like him, if it wasn't for the grace of God, probably wouldn't be where I am now. But that's where, again, you have to have a strong fortitude in whatever your spiritual belief is. You have to have something spiritual that carries you through this, because you are constantly being attacked. You was making some statements, but your patients will even come in and say little snide things to you. You know, I always make it a habit, is, you know, when the MA calls them in, they'll call them in, oh, Rhonda, come on in the room. But when I see her, I'm going to call her Mrs. Johnson. I'm going to say, Mrs. Johnson, how are you? And I always made that point. You would always have that patient come in, hi, Nita, how you doing? And I'm like, but you understood what they were trying to say, you know. You understood that they were trying to take you.
Put you on their level.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know, it wasn't so much, you just didn't belong. And so you had to have the fortitude that you belong. You have to.
I really like those points about the family, and for me, just going through medical training and being the first doctor on either side of my family, and not having someone quickly to reference to. My mother, who worked with physicians all the time as a psychiatric social worker, she flat out said, I've seen some dumb doctors at this hospital. So I know you can do this.
Exactly. I mean, you know, you need that. You need to hear that.
This is the honest to goodness truth. And again, Dr. Johnson always having faith in the new people and saying, why don't you try this? And I said, but I don't know anything about this. And she would say, but you know enough. and you know, and just having someone tell you, just give it a shot. You know, and see where you land, you know, because you do know enough. And I think that's kind of how I look at imposter syndrome. And if I am completely honest with you, the last little vestige of it left after my 10-year board recertification for GI, because that was in 2020.
Okay.
And I finished GI training in 2010. So even beginning as a independent practitioner, I wasn't sure. And it took that research to say, yeah, I know what I'm doing. But another way of looking at it is just to have some healthy amount of doubt, because you don't ever want to think that, again, you're an island to yourself, and you're an island to your knowledge. There's always going to be somebody that, like you mentioned, has had this experience before. And so, you know, thank you both very much for offering your thoughts. We could keep going on, but we have a question. We have a couple questions. Let's open up for questions now. Okay.
I thank you. Thank you both for sharing your experience. And I just want to emphasize that we are all in this for the care of our patients. And there is always that, the other network thought process or syndrome that's out that we can't work collaboratively together. And that's just not true. That's what our employers are saying, but we as a group, as a community, if our focus are our patients, we most certainly should come together. We most certainly should share resources. Are there things within, you know, within your network or your setting that is available that a patient can have access to and probably should have access to, but maybe we just don't know about it? And so I just want to really emphasize that, like, this whole conflict between the big networks, it's not me, it's them. That has nothing to do, even though it does, but it really doesn't have anything to do with me. I want to learn my community of providers within Pittsburgh, and how can we collectively help our patients? I just wanted to thank you guys both for sharing your insights with that.
I will say, and Rhonda knows so much more than I do, but from the insurance side, you know, people think that you can't cross lines. And I'm not going to say it's easy. But if you truly need something medically, you can get it. Now, someone has to advocate, someone has to push through. I mean, if you need to get to Mayo Clinic, you can get to Mayo Clinic. If you need to get to Johns Hopkins, because that's the only person, there's only one doctor in the world who can do your surgery, you can get there. And your insurance should cover it, but it's not easy. So we can advocate for our patients. We can get our patients across the line if that's what we want to do. But see, again, it's work. And that's where we have to say, okay, I'm gonna give a little bit more of myself. And then, you know, I told him earlier, I love this talk about boundaries, because in my age group, we didn't know what boundaries were. We had I had never heard of this word, that didn't exist. So I'm glad you all have found it, but. But because on the other hand, you know, we were working all the time, because you would go home. You would take your patients home with you. You took them home. You were still working on projects for them at home. So I'm not telling you all to go that far anymore, because it may have burned us out. But on the other hand, you can every once in a while take that extra step. You can advocate for your patients. And Rachel, just something you were saying about the imposter syndrome. You know, I was reading some numbers, and they were saying how with affirmative actions, how our grades were a little bit lower when we got in med school, and, you know, and our MCATs might have been a little bit lower when we got in med school. We need to stop letting people feed us that stuff. We have to understand we are the top of our group. We are 5%. Our intelligence is there. We should never let anybody limit us in what we can do. They make us self-doubt.
That's just you taking a good test. You're a good test taker. That's really
Or
good.
you must be fairly smart. I always love that sentence. You must be fairly. I don't know where the fairly came from, but you're fairly.
I think our culture does a whole lot of kneecapping of statements.
Right.
You know, I feel kind of this or sort of that.
But we
never
need
wanna
to
stand
claim
on
it. We need to understand, and I'm not, again, not bragging, but we need to say this is what our gift is and claim it and give it to our kids. That's my other concern. I don't know about you, but the legacy of our kids are not following us. And we're talking about pipeline, but we can't even get our own kids to come in medicine. And that's the issue. When you're own, they can get their kids to come into practice, but we can't get ours. So we have to really figure out what are we doing that our kids look at us and say, no, I don't want to do that.
I think that goes to financial as well, and maybe just all of the struggles that we have. But I think something that, and I don't have children, but I am protective of children. And I think that you need to arm children with the idea that whatever you do in this life is going to be difficult. You got to choose what you care the most about to get through that difficulty. So if you feel a passion to care for people and a passion to join art and science, don't let the difficulty frighten you away, because whatever you choose to do in this life is going to be difficult.
That's right.
You know, I was just, as we all work on our self-improvement and how we continue to grow, and I was speaking with someone the other day who essentially said, you want to be hungry, right? Hungry, humble, and smart. Not necessarily grade smart. And, you know, have a, you know, intellectual, emotional IQ, emotional intelligence. And, you know, some social, you know, some psychologist somewhere said that. And, you know, again, hungry, humble, and smart. And you want to surround yourself with people like that as well, that have at least on a given day 2 out of 3 of those characteristics. They don't have to have all of them all the time, right? You know, you don't want someone who has hubris, who they're just so arrogant, you know what, great. They will achieve on your own. They don't need you or a team to do it, and nor is your team going to actually function well in their presence. So you want hungry, humble, and smart. And then from there, you actually want to continue to work on, and you mentioned this whole idea of things are not always going to be easy. My kids know, you know, I always say comfort is the prequel to complacency, and complacency is the prequel to chaos. You want to live in a nice little area between comfort, never complacency, because you get too comfortable, something's going to slip on you. At the same time, Mike, we talk about the kids wanting to do what we do, right? We laugh, right? Because I will leave the house a little earlier than my wife, not much. She's up already working, and my kids are like, well, Daddy's always relatively happy when he goes to work. She's like, no, this dude leaves before you guys wake up, right? So the assumption is that and they're like, well, he must be happy if he leaves that early. I mean, and that's what my youngest daughter said. And I said, so some of that is a little bit of visual bias, right? They're like, he must be happy going because he goes so early. Why would he? But having them understand that what we do has purpose. Right. That purpose is not going to pull us away from them. And so one kid wants to be a surgeon and the other wants to be a veterinarian because she wants to have a zoo. Now, who knows how long that will last? And we'll support them no matter what they do. But they have to see that, you're right, that we have some level of passion and connectivity with what we do. And that goes back to the first statement she made, right? Of the impact that we can have. And even if it's not medicine that they choose, they will say, what else can I choose to where, you know what, I'm happy to leave early and I'm still relatively happy when I get home, right? You know, it's like, I'm really happy I can afford to pay these bills and the things they want. But that, you know what, they don't have to know that. All they have to know is that, you know, we're pushing forward. I think that's very important with our families and our kids because that permeates to their friends, that permeates to others.
One other
Oh,
question.
no, absolutely, sorry.
We have one other question or statement.
I'm gonna bring it up a little bit. So we're talking about kids, right? So mind you, not your kids in this room, but what is wrong with the younger generation right now? Because I was asking myself, where is the drive? It seems like the drive died with MLK Jr. Like it died way back. Because even now, when I sit in my office and I say, do you know you can be a doctor? They snicker, they have the side look, and I'm like, I want to go, what is wrong with you? Yes, you can be. No offense to my nurses, but, you know, they tell me, oh, I got a scholarship for nursing. When I say you can aim a little higher, they look at me like they don't believe it, or they look at me, one asked me yesterday, she said, oh, that's a lot of work. And, you know, my first thought was, hey, Mom, can you step out?
Yeah.
But it's like, where is the drive? Well, before you answer that, I know you want to answer it. My second question is, again, what happened to the drive? I went to, my medical training was actually in a place where there were not a lot of people like me. The one person I have to credit her for me being here today. She found me at my lowest point, and she was still able to drive. But one thing she said to me was she would not tell me the whole story. She said, oh, you'll be fine. I'm like, what do you mean I'll be fine? You're like, this thing is hard. They told me, you don't belong here. They didn't hide this mission. They're telling you, you don't belong here. I'm not talking about Detroit, Michigan, where there are more of us. This is Lansing, Michigan. So I gotta drive 60 minutes to find people like me, if I wanted to find people like me, even then. So I'm stuck in this place, and she's telling me, you'll be fine. When I finally learned about her path, she had exactly the same path I had. The same medical school, the same medical training. And I always go back to, what happened to, we never got to have this conversation. But it's just, what do you mean I'll be fine? You could have told me you had this experience. So when we have people like that, it's like saying to someone who an alcoholic, drug abuse, whatever you want to call them, and we treat them in our office and we say, you go home, you'll be fine. Do you know they're going back to the same environment? They might never come out of that. So I wonder now, when we are here, when we are doing this every day, maybe not just us, maybe other people, do we say the same thing, like you be fine? Because I want to share my story. I want to say, look, it was hard. But you know what? The only grace I had was one or two people in my path. But then the thing I kept hearing every day was God saying, oh no, you don't quit. This is where you belong.
I think your last part is the most powerful statement, because I can't sit here and think that everyone responds the same to the same type of encouragement. I know that if someone had told me all of the sleepless nights, time away from my family, the physical pain sometimes associated with work, it can scare people off. But I think it, I think it comes from a place of encouragement and validation. And in terms of someone not wanting to work that hard, a lot of that might just be this very instant gratification society that we live in right now. Anything that we want is at our fingertips. DoorDash, Uber. I order something from Amazon, I get an attitude if it's not there in
Next
3
day.
days.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
some of that is also what we are fighting, is just that a lot of things that are valuable
You know
take a
what,
long time to get
I
to.
also don't think we do know the value of what we're aiming for. I like her, I hear so many young ladies, and they'll tell me, I'm gonna go be a nurse. And I said, well, I thought you wanted to be a doctor. Well, my mom said it's better for me to go be a nurse, you know. And I don't think, again, I think our generations, I think we're slipping away in our generations that we are not teaching our kids to aspire to a higher level. And we're being taught that it's okay to be a lower. And so again, it's us. We have to tell our kids, you have to aspire for more. Yeah, it's work. It is work.
It's always going to be work.
But you're going to work no matter what. You're gonna be down in the mire and clay no matter what.
It's the
So
same
you might as
24
well,
hours of
when
the
you
day
come
that we
up,
all
you
get.
might as well have something when you
Same
get out of it.
24 hours of the day that we all get.
You
And
got 2 more.
yeah,
I want to
okay.
mention one thing on this, but if I don't get, I want to just say to the point you made, right, with the nursing piece, I like exposing my kids to nursing executives. I mean, I like exposing, so when someone says, oh, this may be hard, okay, great. You, being a paralegal and writing a lot, so you know what, let's go over to the law school, you can meet paralegals, you can meet these, you can meet the clerk, because it's not a matter, it goes to the point you made, right? All of our kids, we want to prepare them and hope that we are preparing the future for, not if it is going to be hard, but how you are going to navigate it when it is difficult, because it is coming. It's not even a if. It is going to come in some form, which is probably why the person also, when you made the comment, I do that sometimes with some of my faculty who I know. Dr. McCoy's sitting there laughing because I'll be like, it's gonna be okay. It's gonna be okay. Like I know this, like, you know, and some of that is because we've got this together. But every once, and I tell that to none of my partners, like this is gonna work out. I'm not overly optimistic. I'm not sitting here drinking unicorn blood and dealing with trolls at night. I get that this is a problem. However, how we communicate that, and my mother-in-law did to my wife what you just said. She was a nurse. And see, she did the opposite. She was a nurse from Jamaica, first generation. My wife said, oh, okay, I'm going to do research. She said, no, you need to go be a doctor. And she was like, oh, I'll go do, she said, you can do research and be a doctor, but you're not just going to be, you know, it was very interesting. And so expose them to those varying things, right, and see. But you're right.
And something else is that no decision has to be final. You know, you can tell them, sure, try it out. Get to that point. If you still feel like you have something else to give, something else to offer, you can pivot. I mean, the pandemic was nothing but a pivot for all of us. So I think sometimes making the goal feel more accessible by not building it up so much psychologically. Now, Dr. Johnson, you had something to say.
Yeah, I wanted to say too that for many of us, medicine is a calling. You can't really go against your calling. I know we don't often talk about spirituality and medicine and science, but some of us were brought up with very strong spiritual foundations. Our parents didn't have anything else sometimes but a spiritual foundation. And it was that spiritual foundation that equipped us to get through. See, when I went to medical school, I knew a scripture. Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. No matter what situation I found myself in, that scripture I will repeat. I once had a patient who spit on me when I was a med student. I will never forget that. And I had to repeat that, that I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I had a surgeon who slapped me in the OR, slapped me. Back then, we didn't have Me Too. We didn't have a recourse. And when I talk about the weight of the ancestors, all I could think of was my grandmother, who was so proud of me that I was the first person who graduated from college. And I was going to be the first person ever in the family that was a doctor. So you had to make a choice right there. You know, right after you got slapped, right after you got spit on, in a split second, when your nature, I come from the hood. I fought my way to school in the project of Pittsburgh. So, you know, that wasn't necessarily my nature to just sit there and take that. But I had the scripture, I had that spiritual foundation. And so one thing I think that's so important, whatever your faith is, there are times in your life when it's only your faith journey that can see you through the hard times. And I hope that people have it. If you have a strong faith foundation, you're less likely to commit suicide. That has been proven in statistics. Dr. Conte knows that. But so I encourage everybody to, there has to be a higher purpose than yourself sometimes. There has to be a greater purpose. And when you acknowledge it's your calling, that'll help you get through your trying times. It'll help you to see bigger than the patient that's in your door. I also want to put a plug in while I have, and I'm going to be quiet, for the Gateway Medical Society. These doctors are more than just colleagues. I look at Anita, she took care of my mother. I trusted her to be my mother's doctor. I trust Dr. Hawkins. Oh, I call him back. I'm going to give you a call next time. I trust him to be my son's doctor. It was doctors that aren't in this room that when my son needed an emergency, that got me to Dr. Hogan. I trusted Dr. Tony to do my colonoscopy. So again, this is an organization that's more than just on paper. When you get to trust people to care for your own family, that's a high level of trust. And I really appreciate the Gateway Medical Society. I really do. One of the best things you can do is join the Gateway Medical Society. And they will be there for you when you're in crisis and your family's in crisis. And I'm done.
I think that's a perfect time to close. This has been a wonderful day.
Absolutely.
I have learned so much from everyone here. I appreciate everybody for
I would like to put
saying
in
what
one
they have to
plug.
say. Yes.
One plug. We do have a program called Journey to Medicine, which is our pipeline program. We didn't get to talk about it a lot today, but at some point we really should present that because that is our hope. It needs help. I'm not going to say it doesn't, but it is a start, and it is a way for us to help our inner youth enter into health sciences.
Yes.
Amen.
Amen.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hold on.
For coming. I hope what you leave with today is a sense of your value and your worth. You know, one of the things we talked about before is the fact that some of the struggles center around the fact that we allow other people to assign our value, right? And that has a catastrophic effect and a snowball effect on us. And just as Dr. Johnson said, when you are here, we're not claiming that we're perfect, but you will know that you are valued here. We treasure each and every one of you for the gifts that you have, your talents, your abilities, your drive, your passion, and we absolutely want you to be able, if you're looking for a landing spot to put those things to work, there is work here to be done in this city. And we have a tremendous opportunity with a growing membership, with diverse ideas, to be able to change some things. We want to change the narrative of the dreams that our children grow up with. People in this room can help shape those dreams. So those kids who don't feel they can be doctors, if we do nothing else but interact with them so that they leave with a change in their dream and say, you know what, I can be a doctor. I mean, I just know personally I've had these transformational experiences where I sit with a group of, say, 6th or 7th graders, and I simply tell them, you know what, I was not a straight A student. They already know I'm a doctor. They put those two things instantly together, and now it's transformed many of them to know that I don't have to have a 4.0 to be a doctor. I'm not discounting the 4.0, but they also need to know that your journey doesn't have to be one of perfection. And so the time we spend with each other and the time we spend with students and our patients is valuable. So again, thank you guys so much. I want to remind you that if you have not signed your name, if you're looking to get CME or CNE credits, please sign that form that's at the table before you leave today. Also, if you have not become a member of Gateway, please visit the website. There are membership applications on the table as well. Again, it's not just what we ask of you, but it's what you demand of us. As the leadership of this organization, it's your gateway. We want to make it what you feel it needs to be to continue to be consistent with our now going on 7 decades of service to each other and the communities that we serve. And then I want to remind people that a week from Monday, which is I think the 25th, maybe? No, 27th. Not this Monday.
25th.
The 25th, we have our quarterly general membership meeting. We have a quarterly meeting, and this will be the second one since COVID that we've been able to meet in person. The ones in the past have been virtual. This will be at the Capitol Grill at no cost to you. At the Capitol Grill, you do need to pre-register, and Tamara can give you information on that. And then the next one after that will be in May. But we meet quarterly, and then in the summer, we typically have a summer social gathering for the general membership that typically coincides with the Journey to Medicine's picnic, so that you get a chance to meet some of the scholars in that program. So again, there's lots of things going on, and we are so happy that you could be with us today. I think that's everything. If you have any specific things that you'd like to see for the next provider symposium, or things that you'd like to see us present for our community symposium, please let us know. Even if it's not an area of expertise where you feel qualified or comfortable speaking on it, but you think it would be valuable, please let us know, because this is not a committee of one or programming in a vacuum. We want to include everybody's thoughts and ideas. So thank you guys again. If anyone would like one of my cards, I'll have them up here. I'm happy to share. If you get a chance, please share your contact information and then join our WhatsApp group. We have a growing WhatsApp group, which gives you an opportunity to communicate at a different level about lots of different things. So again, thank you guys. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for being our facilitator. Thank you, Tamara, for organizing the event. We can't do much, if any, of what we do without Tamara being here doing what she does. And so we are so grateful for that. So again, thank you guys. Have a great rest of the afternoon and a great weekend.